Mara Rourke didn't bother lowering her voice. That was the worst part. She stood right there on the porch of the Rourke ranch house, not 10 feet from the woman who had just climbed down from a stagecoach after 31 days of travel, and she said it loud enough for the ranch hands to hear. Loud enough for the children peeking from the barn door to hear. Loud enough for the words to carry across the dust and settle into every crack of that October morning, like something permanent. Lord Almighty, Caleb. That is not the woman in the photograph. She wasn't whispering it to her brother. She wasn't pulling him aside. She was announcing it. Her chin tilted up, her arms folded tight across her chest, and her eyes moved from her brother's face back to the woman standing beside the stagecoach, with a worn leather satchel in one hand, and a small tin box pressed against her side like it was the only thing in the world she trusted not to be taken from her. Evelyn Mercer heard every syllable. She had been traveling since September. She had slept sitting upright for 5 nights in a row. She had eaten cold biscuits and dried jerky somewhere outside of Cheyenne when the driver stopped for 20 minutes at a trading post that smelled of animal fat and old smoke. She had ridden through a hailstorm in Nebraska that cracked 2 of the coach windows and left a bruise along her right shoulder that still ached when she lifted her arm above her head. And now she was standing in the cold Montana air with 43 people in that small frontier town pretending not to stare at her, while Mara Rourke made sure they didn't have to pretend at all. If you've ever been looked at like you were the wrong answer to someone else's question, stay with this story. Because what happened next in Blackwater Ridge changed everything. We tell stories like this one every week, stories of ordinary people who refuse to disappear. This one moves you. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that October morning. Back to the woman standing in the dust with her tin box and her dignity, while a town made up its mind about her before she'd spoken a single word. The stagecoach driver set her second bag down beside her left boot without ceremony and climbed back up to his seat. He had a schedule to keep. He did not look at her when he did it. He had stopped looking at her somewhere around the Colorado border. Once he understood that she noticed everything, and that being noticed by Evelyn Mercer felt, somehow, like being measured. She was 34 years old. She was not small. She had never been small, not since she was 11, and her mother's sister had remarked at a Sunday table that Evelyn ate like she was planning for a famine. She had wide shoulders and heavy hands and a face that people sometimes described as plain until they looked at it longer and revised their opinion without being able to say exactly why. She had dark hair she kept pinned back tightly, not because she cared about propriety, but because loose hair annoyed her, and she had no patience for things that annoyed her when she was working. She looked at Mara Rourke. Then she looked at the man standing beside Mara. Caleb Rourke was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed about him, and based on the reactions of every person who came within 20 feet of him, it seemed to be the last thing they forgot. He was 6 feet 4 inches of Montana rancher, broad through the shoulders in a way that made door frames look like they'd been designed as an afterthought, with hands that could close around a fence post, and arms that had thrown a full-grown steer more than once when the situation called for it. He had a jaw like something cut from the local rock, and eyes the color of creek water in November gray-green and still and not particularly warm. He was staring at her, not the way Mara was staring. Mara's stare was the stare of a woman cataloging a disappointment. Caleb's stare was different. It was the stare of a man recalculating something he had believed settled. He had the photograph. She knew he had the photograph. The agency Hartwell's Western Placement Service out of Cincinnati had sent him a photograph of Evelyn taken 7 years ago, before her mother's illness, before the years of managing other people's households through other people's crises, before the weight that came with grief and bad winters and meals eaten standing at someone else's stove at midnight because there was no other time. The woman in that photograph was younger and lighter, and wearing a dress that had been borrowed for the occasion. That woman and the woman now standing in the dust of Blackwater Ridge were the same person. Evelyn had never claimed otherwise, but she understood, looking at Caleb Rourke's face, that he had not been prepared for the gap between the two versions of her. "The agency sent you that photograph," she said. Her voice was level. She did not offer it as an apology. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Around them, the town continued doing what small towns do when something uncomfortable happens in public. It pretended to be busy with other things. A man near the general store found something interesting about his boot heel. Two women by the milliner's window turned just slightly away without moving their feet. They did, Caleb said finally. I'm not her anymore. Evelyn adjusted the strap of her satchel on her shoulder. If that changes your arrangements, the next stage comes through in 4 days. I can stay at the boarding house until then. She said it cleanly, not bitterly, not as though she was asking him to contradict her. She said it the way a person states a fact that they have already made peace with, or at least made a temporary truce with, which was the most she could honestly claim. Mara made a small sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something worse. Caleb's jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing on words he hadn't decided whether to say yet. You've come a long way, he said at last. I have. You hungry? It was not what she expected. She had expected him to dismiss her. She had prepared herself for dismissal, the way she'd prepared herself for the hailstorm, not by believing it wouldn't happen, but by deciding in advance that she would survive it. Could eat, Evelyn said. The Rourke Ranch was 3 miles outside Blackwater Ridge, set against a low ridge of hills that blocked the worst of the winter wind from the northwest. The main house was 2 stories of timber and river stone, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a kitchen addition built onto the back that someone had constructed in a hurry and never quite finished properly. One of the kitchen windows had a crack running diagonally across the lower pane. The garden plot beside the east wall had been turned over and left fallow not recently. The fence posts along the north pasture needed resetting. None of this was what Evelyn was looking at when the wagon rolled up the approach road. She was watching the 2 children standing on the porch. A boy maybe 9 years old, thin in the way children get thin when they haven't been eating well, not starving, but hollowed, like something had taken the roundness out of his face and replaced it with a kind of watchful resignation. And a girl younger, maybe 6, standing slightly behind the boy, with her hand gripping the back of his shirt and her eyes very wide. Who are they? Evelyn asked. Eli and Sadie, Caleb said from the driver's seat. He said their names the way people say the names of things they love and worry about in the same breath. Yours, my brothers. He passed 2 winters ago. His wife before that, he paused. They're mine now. Evelyn looked at the children a moment longer. Eli had spotted the wagon and was now watching it approach with an expression of careful neutrality, a 9-year-old's attempt at not appearing to hope for anything. Sadie had not relaxed her grip on his shirt. What do they eat? Evelyn asked. Caleb glanced at her sideways. What? What do they eat? What are their meals? He looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the question and everything to do with the answer. Whatever Mrs. Pruitt puts together. She comes 3 days a week. Otherwise. He stopped. Otherwise they eat whatever's available, Evelyn said. He didn't deny it. She said nothing more. But when the wagon stopped and she climbed down with her satchel and her tin box, she did not look at the main house first. She looked at Eli. The boy looked back at her with those careful, cautious eyes, and then looked away, as if he'd learned that looking at new things directly only made it worse when they disappeared. Mara had ridden ahead on horseback and was waiting in the front room when they came through the door. She had used the 3 miles to arrange herself into something that wasn't quite hostility and wasn't quite welcome the posture of a woman who had decided to be fair about something she had already decided against. The front room was comfortable in a utilitarian way. There were good chairs and a solid tables and a stone fireplace that had seen a lot of winters. There were no flowers. There were no curtains on 2 of the 3 windows. There was a mount on the wall above the fireplace, where something had hung the outline was still visible in the slightly less sun-faded wood, and whatever it had been was gone. Your room is upstairs, Mara said. Second door on the left. It's small. Thank you, Evelyn said. I'll show you where things are in the kitchen tomorrow. Mrs. Pruitt keeps her own system, and she doesn't like it disturbed. I understand. Mara's eyes moved to the tin box Evelyn was still carrying. What's that? Recipes? A silence. Recipes, Mara repeated, as if the word had a smell she wasn't sure about.
Yes.
Evelyn went upstairs. The room was small. Mara had not been wrong about that. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked north toward the ridge. The floor had a gap between 2 boards that let in cold air from below. The mattress was thin enough that she could feel the rope support through it when she sat down. She set her satchel on the floor and held the tin box in her lap for a moment. It had belonged to her mother. Not the recipes, those she had written herself, accumulated over 20 years of working in other people's houses, cooking for other people's families. But the box had been her mother's, A flat tin with a painted lid that had once shown a pastoral scene of indeterminate European origin, and now showed mostly rust along the edges and a smear of something brown that had been there since before Evelyn could remember. She did not open it. She set it on the washstand where she could see it from the bed, and then she lay down without removing her boots, because she was too tired to manage them. And she looked at the ceiling, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch below her, Caleb's boots on the floor, Mara's voice saying something short and uninviting, the distant murmur of Eli, saying something to Sadie that Sadie answered with silence. She did not sleep. She was too tired to sleep, which was a thing that happened to her. Sometimes the exhaustion going so deep it looped back around into a restless, aching wakefulness. She lay there and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that she had traveled over 1,000 miles to sleep in a cold room, with a cracked floor and a mattress that felt like a reproach. She thought about turning around. The thought lasted about 30 seconds. Then she got up, took off her boots, and started unpacking her satchel. In the morning, she was up before anyone else. This was not unusual. She had spent the better part of 15 years being the first person awake in whatever house she was managing, and her body had stopped requiring an alarm of any kind. Simply opened her eyes at 5 o'clock, regardless of what she had decided the night before. The kitchen was cold. The fire in the iron stove had been banked badly. Whoever had done it the night before had left too much ash packed around the coals, which would have smothered them by morning, and she could see from 6 feet away that the fire was out. The ash drawer was overfull. There were dishes from supper still in the dry sink, crusted with something that had been beans, and a cast-iron skillet on the stovetop with grease congealed in the bottom that someone had wiped at with a rag and given up on. She rebuilt the fire. This took 20 minutes and some patience. The ash drawer she pulled out and took to the ash pile at the far corner of the yard, carrying it in the cold pre-dawn dark with her coat pulled on over her nightclothes, not because she had decided to take over the kitchen, but because she needed hot water, and she was not willing to wait for someone else to make it possible. While the fire came up, she went through the kitchen. The pantry was a revelation of neglect and accidental abundance. There was flour 2 kinds, a fine milled wheat and a coarser grade that she suspected had been bought for livestock feed, but was perfectly edible. There were dried beans in 3 varieties. There was a crock of lard in the corner that was still good. She lifted the cloth and smelled it, set it back down. There was a cluster of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling that someone had gathered and forgotten: sage, thyme, something that might have been marjoram if she was being generous. There was a jar of rendered beef fat with a paper lid. There was a tin of salt that was partly caked. And at the back of the lowest shelf, behind a broken crock and a sack of cornmeal, she found what she almost couldn't believe she was seeing: a sourdough starter, in a sealed stoneware jar. She lifted it carefully and carried it to the light. Cloth was tied tightly at the neck. She loosened it and leaned in and breathed, still alive. A faint, yeasty smell that meant whatever organism was living in that jar had been hanging on through months of neglect and cold, waiting for someone to pay attention to it. She sat down at the kitchen table with the jar in her hands and felt, for the first time since Cincinnati, something that was not anxiety or exhaustion, or the grinding work of holding herself together. She felt interested. The onion was the moment everything nearly went wrong. She had found 4 onions in the root cellar, small, starting to go soft at the crown but salvageable, and she had put one directly into the iron skillet over the open flame without any fat. She wanted the char. She needed the char. Properly blackened onions split open and dropped into a pot of water with bone and herb made a broth that most people tasted once and then spent the rest of their lives chasing without knowing why. She had done this in 9 different kitchens in 4 states. She had never burned down any of them. The smoke was the problem. It was not a dangerous amount of smoke. It was the specific sharp, dark smell of something intentionally burning that rises quickly and fills a room, and to the uninitiated presents itself as evidence of disaster. And it was 6:15 in the morning, and the house was quiet, and Caleb Rourke was apparently a very light sleeper. She heard him before she saw him, boots hitting the floor above her head, then the stairs fast, no hesitation, the kind of speed that meant he was already awake and moving before he'd finished deciding to. He came through the kitchen door, like he was prepared to carry someone out of it, stopped when he saw her. She was standing at the stove in her work dress, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her hair still half-pinned from sleep, holding a long-handled fork, watching the onion blacken with the focused attention of someone performing surgery. She did not look up immediately. She was watching the skin of the onion for the exact moment the char went from productive to counterproductive. He stopped himself. She could feel him taking stock of the room, running through the possibilities, landing on the fact that there was no actual fire, that she was standing there calmly, that the smoke was coming from a skillet and not a wall or a ceiling or anything structural. "Good morning," Evelyn said. "What are you doing?" "Making broth." She turned the onion with the fork, checking the underside. Almost there. The children need something with more nutrition than whatever they've been eating. "I found a starter in the pantry. There are bones in the cellar. I'll need to send someone for them later. For now, I'm starting with what's here." "You're burning an onion." "I'm charring it. There's a difference." She glanced at him. He was in the doorway with his suspenders hanging and his shirt half buttoned and an expression on his face that was somewhere between confusion and the beginning of irritation. He was very large in that doorway. She had registered this the day before, but in the full daylight of the kitchen, with no distance between them, it was more pronounced. He was the kind of large that made you adjust your spatial understanding of a room. "Smells like something died," he said. "It smells like something's being made," she corrected. Two different things. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at the stove, then at the jar on the table, then at the arrangement of herbs she'd brought in from the pantry and laid out in order of how she intended to use them. "You been up long?" he said. "A while." "Why?" She glanced at him again. The fire was out. The ash drawer was full. "I couldn't start on anything until I'd dealt with that." Something moved in his expression, not quite guilt, but an awareness of it, which was close enough. He said nothing for a moment. "Then Mrs. Pruitt comes 3 days a week," Evelyn said. "On the other 4 days, the fire goes out, and the drawer fills up, and nobody notices until morning." She pulled the onion off the heat. It was right. The skin was cracked and black in the places she needed, yielding and sweet underneath, where the heat had done its slow work. Split it with a knife and dropped it into the pot she had on the back of the stove, with the water already beginning to move. "You don't have to do all of this," Caleb said. "I know. You just got here." "I know that too." She added the herbs, pinching the dried thyme into the pot and crushing it between her fingers first to wake it up. "But the children look like they haven't had a proper meal in months. That's not something I can see and do nothing about." Silence. She stirred the pot. "Eli doesn't eat," Caleb said finally. He said it quietly, the way people say things they've been carrying a long time and still haven't figured out where to put down. He goes through the motions, sits at the table, moves food around. He ate fine when his mother. Start again. "It's been 2 years. Evelyn said nothing. She let the silence sit for a moment, because some things don't need to be filled, and because she was paying attention to the pot. "Let's see if he eats this," she said. Eli came downstairs at 7:15. Led partly by Sadie pulling on his sleeve and partly by something he couldn't identify that had been working on him since he'd woken up and found the kitchen smelling different from every other morning of the past 2 years. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his stocking feet, with his hair still pressed flat on one side from sleep, and looked at the woman, stirring something at the stove, and at the way the kitchen looked the cleared table, the herbs laid out, the jar of starter on the windowsill, where the morning light was hitting it, and then he looked at his uncle, who was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and not reading the newspaper in front of him. "That smell." "Broth," Evelyn said. She didn't look up. "Sit down." He didn't sit down. He came one step further into the kitchen and stood with his arms slightly out from his sides the way children do when they're not sure whether they're staying. Sadie pushed past him and climbed directly into a chair at the table with the confidence of someone who has decided this is interesting. Pressed her nose toward the table as if the smell were a visible thing she could get closer to. "Is it ready?" Sadie asked. "Almost. What's in it?" Eli said. Evelyn considered the question seriously, which she could tell he hadn't expected. "Charred onion, thyme, marjoram if I'm right about what that herb is. Beef bone from last night's supper, your uncle saved it. I found it in the cold box salt, a bay leaf, and whatever else was interesting in your pantry." Eli looked at his uncle. "Don't look at me," Caleb said. "She found a sourdough starter I didn't know we had." "It was behind a broken crock," Evelyn said. "Someone put it there and either forgot or gave up on it. It's still alive, which means whoever started it knew what they were doing, even if nobody kept it going." "That was my mother," Caleb said. He said it flatly without ceremony. "Kept a starter for about 20 years. A small silence. Then it's a good one, Evelyn said. Good starters don't come from nowhere. She ladled a small measure of broth into a cup, not a bowl, a cup, which she'd chosen deliberately because it felt like less of a commitment, less like a meal and more like a taste, and set it in front of Eli. The boy looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Evelyn was watching him from the corner of her eye while pretending to stir the pot. She didn't say anything. She had learned in many years of cooking for other people's children that there is a particular kind of refusal that is not stubbornness but fear, the fear of wanting something and being disappointed. Children who hadn't eaten properly didn't trust food the way healthy children did. They'd gotten used to things tasting like obligation. She waited. Eli picked up the cup with both hands the way small children do, even though he was 9 and trying not to seem like a small child. He brought it to his mouth. He tilted it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at the cup, and then at Evelyn, and then back at the cup. "Can I have more?" he said. It was a small thing. A cup of broth. 4 words from a skinny 9-year-old in stocking feet. Evelyn turned back to the pot so that he wouldn't see her face. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." Mara came downstairs 20 minutes later to find her brother at the kitchen table with 2 children and a cup of coffee, watching a woman he'd met yesterday ladle broth into bowls with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this in this kitchen for years. Stood in the doorway. Eli was on his second bowl. He wasn't shoveling it, he was eating carefully, deliberately, with the focused attention of someone rediscovering something. Sadie had her hands around her cup and was making small satisfied noises that she was entirely unaware of. Caleb was watching them both with an expression that Mara hadn't seen on his face in 2 winters and couldn't quite name. "There's enough for you," Evelyn said without turning around. "Bowls on the shelf." Mara opened her mouth, closed it. She got a bowl. She sat at the table. She ate. She didn't say anything. She looked at her nephew eating, at her niece making those sounds, at her brother's face. And then she looked at Evelyn's back, the wide, solid back of a woman who had been up since before dawn rebuilding a fire and making something out of nothing in someone else's kitchen, and she thought something she did not say out loud. She was not ready to say it out loud. She was not sure she would ever be ready, but she thought it. She had been wrong this fast about very few people in her life. The morning after the broth, Caleb found her in the pantry reorganizing the shelves. Not the chaotic, aggressive reorganization of someone staking territory, but the methodical, quiet reorganization of someone trying to understand a system so they can make it work better. She was moving things with the deliberate care of a woman who respected that this was someone else's pantry and was trying not to make it worse while she figured out how to make it better. "Mrs. Pruitt's going to have opinions about that," Caleb said. "I'll talk to Mrs. Pruitt." Evelyn examined a jar of something unlabeled and sniffed the lid. "This is still good. Whatever it is." She set it on the second shelf. "Does she have a written system for where things go?" "Not written. It's in her head?" "Mostly she just knows where she put things." Evelyn nodded as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "That works until she's not here. Then nobody knows." Caleb leaned against the pantry doorframe, with his arms crossed, watching her work. He had a quality of stillness when he wasn't in motion, a rancher's patience, the capacity to wait and observe without fidgeting. He'd had it since boyhood, according to Mara, who claimed it made him insufferable at card games, because nobody could read whether he had anything. "You managed houses before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "For 15 years. She moved the cornmeal to where it could be reached without moving 3 other things. Mostly large households. One had 14 staff. One had 9 children, not mine, obviously." "Why'd you stop?" A pause. She was examining a tin of baking powder, checking the date someone had written on the lid in pencil. "The family I was with last, the Hartleys, out of Davenport, the wife passed. The husband remarried within 8 months. The new wife brought her own household staff from her previous situation. She set the tin down. I was given 3 weeks and a letter of reference. After 15 years. After 12 years with that particular family, yes. Prior 3 were with 2 other households." She didn't say it bitterly. It was stated as information, accurate and complete. "I was 42 when I came to this territory. I am now 34, which you may find mathematically impossible, but I assure you the arithmetic makes sense." He looked at her. She glanced back at him, and there was something in her face, not quite humor, but close to it, the edge of something dry. "I meant I was 42 when I arrived at the agency," she said. "Not the stage." He caught it a beat late, and then one corner of his mouth moved in a way it hadn't moved since she'd arrived. You didn't have to fix my arithmetic, she said. I was making a point. I know. He uncrossed his arms. What was the point? That I have been doing this a long time. I'm good at it. And I didn't spend 31 days on that stage to stand in your pantry apologizing for being here. The stillness again. Looking at her. Nobody asked you to apologize, he said. Your sister did, without words. He didn't deny it. The letter arrived on the 12th day. Came in a mail packet with 3 other envelopes, a supply order, a bill from the harness maker in Billings, and something from Caleb's lawyer in Helena that he set aside to read later. The 4th envelope was addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize, with a Cincinnati postmark and the name of a solicitor's firm in the upper left corner. He opened it at the kitchen table after supper while Evelyn was washing the dishes, and Eli was doing his schoolwork at the far end of the table with César lying on the floor beside him, already asleep with her cheek on her arm. He read it twice. This is from a law firm in Cincinnati, he said. Evelyn dried her hands on her apron. Is it about me? Indirectly. He set the letter on the table and pushed it toward her. They represent a family named Hartley. She went very still. They're writing to inform me, Caleb said, watching her face, that as part of your placement through Hartwell's agency, references were provided, and that the Hartley family has now provided a supplemental reference, which they apparently weren't required to do under the agency's terms, but did voluntarily. Picked up the letter. Read it. The Hartley supplemental reference was 4 paragraphs long. It described, in the careful language of attorneys who charge by the word, the following: that Evelyn Mercer had managed the Hartley household for 12 years, that in that time she had overseen the care of 6 children, 2 of whom had been ill for extended periods requiring significant medical management, that in the winter of 1877 she had managed the household through an outbreak of fever that took the cook and 2 housemaids and still maintained full operations, that she had also managed a kitchen fire in 1878, that she had contained herself before it reached the main structure, that she had maintained household accounts with complete accuracy, and had, on 3 occasions, identified and corrected errors made by external bookkeepers. The final paragraph noted that the firm had been instructed by the Hartley family to provide this reference because, in the words of the family, they had treated Miss Mercer's departure poorly and wanted it on record that she had served them with exceptional competence and integrity, and that any household receiving her would be fortunate. Evelyn set the letter down. She looked at the far wall for a moment, just a moment. Then she folded the letter carefully, as if it were something that might break, and set it back on the table. You didn't show me this at the agency, Caleb said. The agency didn't have it at the agency. Mr. Hartley's new wife, the one who replaced me, apparently had a difficult winter, and he felt guilty. She looked at her hands on the table. 12 years late. It's here now, yes. He picked up the letter, folded it, stood up. I'm putting this in the strong box, he said. She looked up at him. In case there's ever a question, he said, about who you are and what you're worth. He left the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table for a long time after, in the quiet with the lamp burning, and Sadie asleep on the floor, and the sound of Eli's pencil moving across his schoolwork, and she did not cry, because she had stopped crying about the Hartleys 3 years ago, and she was not going to start again tonight. But her hands, when she finally got up and put out the lamp, were not entirely steady. On the 14th day, Mara came into the kitchen at mid-morning, and stood in the middle of the room, and said nothing for long enough that Evelyn set down what she was doing. She was working the sourdough. Starter had come back fully in 4 days fed and warm, and doing what a good starter does when properly managed, which is produce, reliably and without drama, the raw material for bread that tastes like it came from somewhere real. She had a mass of dough on the board that she'd been turning for the past several minutes, the heels of her hands pressing and folding in a rhythm that was automatic enough that she could look at Mara while her hands kept going. He hadn't eaten properly in 2 years, Mara said. She said it to the window, not to Evelyn. Eli, I tried. I am not a cook. I tried to learn after his father died. Couldn't make anything he'd eat. He just stopped. Evelyn kept working the dough. I thought it was grief, Mara said, and maybe it was. But whatever you put in that pot, she stopped. Started again. He ate 3 bowls yesterday, 3. I counted them. He's making up for lost time, Evelyn said. Whatever it is. Mara turned from the window. Her face had the particular tight quality of someone saying something that they've decided is necessary and still don't want to say. Keep doing it. Whatever you're doing. Don't stop. She left before Evelyn could answer, which was probably better, because Evelyn's answer would have been, "I wasn't planning to." And that would have required her to explain that she had stopped planning to leave sometime around the fourth day, around the time she'd seen Eli's face over that first cup of broth, and that she was not a woman who left things unfinished, and that this ranch and these children and this worn-out kitchen with the cracked window and the neglected sourdough this had become, in less than 2 weeks, something she was going to finish. Turned the dough, folded it, pressed it. Outside, she could hear Sadie in the yard, talking to something, a cat, probably, or a fence post. It was sometimes hard to tell with Sadie. Inside, the kitchen smelled like bread that hadn't happened yet, and wood smoke, and the onion she was going to char for tonight's soup. She worked the dough. She was not going anywhere. The bread came out wrong the first time. Not badly wrong, not inedible, but wrong in the way that bread made in an unfamiliar oven is always a little wrong. Because every iron stove has its own temperament and its own hot spots, and its own particular relationship with heat that takes time to learn. The bottom crust was darker than she wanted. The crumb was tighter than it should have been. She'd misjudged the temperature on the second rise, because the kitchen faced north and the morning light she'd used as a reference in a dozen other kitchens behaved differently here. Cold coming off the ridge, keeping the room cooler longer than she'd accounted for. Put the loaf on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she cut it, put butter on a slice, and handed it to Eli. Ate 2 slices before she'd finished cleaning the board. She filed the notes away in her head. More heat on the second rise. Adjust the timing by about 20 minutes, watch the bottom rack, and moved on. That was the thing about bread. It told you where you'd miscalculated, and it gave you another chance tomorrow. Most things in Evelyn's experience were less generous than that. The kitchen had become, in a matter of 2 weeks, a different room from the one she'd first walked into. Not because she had renovated it or replaced anything, she had replaced nothing. Because nothing was hers to replace, and she had no money to replace it with anyway. But she had cleaned the grease from the stovetop joints that had been collecting since the previous winter. She had found the source of the cold draft coming under the east wall and packed it with oilcloth and a strip of wool blanket cut from something past mending. She had reseasoned the iron skillet with rendered fat and salt and heat until the surface was black and even and trustworthy. She had reorganized the pantry not by what she preferred but by what the household actually used most often, with the flour and salt and lard at reaching height, and the things used less frequently on the upper and lower shelves where they didn't create obstacles. These were small things. None of them were dramatic. They were the accumulated small decisions of a woman who had managed other people's households long enough to know that the difference between a kitchen that worked and one that didn't was almost never one large problem, it was 30. Small ones that nobody had gotten around to solving. Mrs. Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into Evelyn's time at the ranch and stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on and her basket over her arm and looked at the room for a long time without saying anything. She was a compact, efficient woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair and the hands of someone who had spent 50 years in practical work. She had a direct way of looking at things, not unfriendly, but not soft. She had cooked and cleaned for the Rourke ranch since Caleb's mother had been alive, which was a long time, and she had a specific relationship with this kitchen that was less like employment and more like tenancy. Evelyn waited. "You moved the cornmeal," Mrs. Pruitt said. "I did. It's on the second shelf now. Left side. You can reach it without moving anything else." A silence. "I had a system," Mrs. Pruitt said. "You did." "I tried to keep the logic of it and just adjust the parts that created extra steps." Evelyn was at the stove, not looking at her. "If you want to move it back, I understand. It's your kitchen." Another silence longer. "It's not my kitchen," Mrs. Pruitt said. She set her basket on the table. It was Ruth's kitchen. Ruth's been gone 6 years. She unwound her coat. "What did you do to the skillet?" "Reseasoned it." Mrs. Pruitt picked it up from the stovetop, turned it over, looked at the cooking surface. She ran her thumb across it once. She put it back down without comment. "Starter's going again," she said. It was not quite a question. "Still alive when I found it. Just needed feeding." Mrs. Pruitt sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of someone whose knees have been giving her trouble for about a decade. She looked at the jar on the windowsill where the sourdough was working, and something in her face shifted slightly, not enough to call an expression, but something. "Ruth kept that going for 22 years, she said. "Past, I didn't." She stopped, smoothed her apron over her lap. I kept meaning to tend it, and then I didn't. It survived, Evelyn said. That's the main thing. Yes. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her hands on the table. I suppose it did. They worked alongside each other for the rest of the morning without much conversation. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not combative either. It was the careful negotiation of two capable women sharing a space that neither of them owned, working out without words who moved where and when and how. By noon they had established, without discussing it, a kind of working arrangement, Mrs. Pruitt handled the things she had always handled, and Evelyn handled the things that had been falling through the gaps, and they did not get in each other's way. When Mrs. Pruitt left in the afternoon, she paused at the kitchen door and said, without turning around, "The boy ate this morning. Caleb told me. Said he ate a proper breakfast." "He did," Evelyn said. "Good." She opened the door. "He's a good boy. He just stopped." "I know," Evelyn said. Mrs. Pruitt left. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment in the afternoon quiet and then turned back to the stove, because there was supper to make, and she was already thinking about it. The garden was Caleb's idea, which surprised her. He mentioned it on a Friday morning. Standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, he always held his hat when he came into the kitchen. She had noticed the way men hold hats in rooms where they feel they should be polite, and said that the east plot beside the house had been cleared for a garden 3 years ago, but never planted because the year his sister-in-law had been planning it was the year she'd gotten sick. "The soil's probably still workable," he said. "If you wanted." She looked at him. "I'll need seeds. Haggerty's store in town has them. I can send for a catalog if you'd prefer to choose." "What does the household need most?" He thought about it. She liked he actually thought about it rather than saying whatever you think the way men sometimes did when they wanted to seem agreeable without committing to anything. He stood there and actually considered the question. "Root vegetables keep best through winter. Eli likes corn. Sadie won't touch turnips, but she'll eat beets if they're cooked right." "How are they cooked right?" "I have no idea. She just says some are right and some aren't." Evelyn almost smiled. "I'll figure it out." So the garden began, which added an hour to her morning, and required a conversation with the ranch hand named Dewey about where the good soil was, and whether the irrigation ditch that ran along the north field could be redirected without too much trouble. Dewey was a wiry man of about 50 with a sun-damaged face, and the considered speech of someone who had learned to say only what he was sure about. He told her the ditch could be redirected. It would take half a day and some materials. He looked at her with the specific expression of a ranch hand, trying to work out what authority this woman actually had on this property. "Mr. Rourke knows about the garden," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at the plot. "Ruth used to keep tomatoes along that south-facing wall. Gets the afternoon heat. Good to know." She made a note of it. "I'll put them there." Dewey nodded and went back to what he'd been doing. The next morning she found the irrigation channel redirected, and a small pile of lumber at the corner of the plot for raised bed frames, placed there without discussion, which was how Dewey communicated that he thought something was worth doing. Planted in the evenings after supper, when the light was low, and the heat had gone out of the day. Sadie began following her out there, which Evelyn had not invited and did not discourage. The girl had a particular quality of presence. She didn't talk constantly the way some children did, filling silence because silence made them uncomfortable. She sat and watched with those wide eyes and asked questions at intervals, serious questions that she clearly thought carefully about before asking. "Why do you put them that deep?" Sadie asked, watching Evelyn set seed potatoes into the ground. "Because they need room to grow downward before they grow upward. Everything needs a foundation first." Sadie considered this. "Eli says you're not staying." Evelyn kept pressing the soil down around the seed potato. "What does Eli say?" "He says people come and then they leave. He says that's how it goes. What do you say?" Sadie looked at her feet. "I don't know yet." "Then, are you leaving?" Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at the girl. The evening light was coming in low and orange from the west, and Sadie's face in it looked very young and very serious. The way children's faces look when they're asking something they've been thinking about for a long time and have finally decided to say. "Not right now," Evelyn said. "I've got a garden to finish." It wasn't a promise. She knew it wasn't a promise. But Sadie seemed to understand that it was the most honest answer available, and she nodded once and picked up a handful of dirt and turned it over in her palm and didn't ask anything more. The trouble with Mara had been coming for a while before it actually arrived. It wasn't the open antagonism of the first days that had softened. or at least grown quieter, which was not the same thing as disappearing. It was more the specific tension of a woman who had decided she was wrong about something and hadn't yet decided what to do with that information. Mara moved through the ranch house with a careful precision, like she was avoiding something she couldn't name, and she watched Evelyn with a sidelong attention that Evelyn recognized because she'd been watched that way before, the watching of someone who has staked a position and is slowly, privately, collecting evidence against it. The actual collision happened on a Saturday 17 days in. Evelyn was at the kitchen table working through the household accounts. Caleb had asked her to look at them, just to see if there was anything he'd missed, and she'd found 3 consistent errors in the supply tallies that had been running for about 8 months and were costing the ranch quietly and steadily in overcharges from the general store. She was making a list of the discrepancies, clean and numbered, with the relevant receipts stacked to the side. Mara came in and saw the account book open on the table and stopped. "What are you doing with that?" she said. "Caleb asked me to look at the supply accounts." "He what?" It came out flat, not a question. He said he'd been feeling like something was off in the numbers, but didn't have time to work through it. Evelyn kept her pen moving. Something was off. The store has been overcharging on the flour orders for about 8 months. It may be an error, or it may be deliberate. Either way, it needs to be corrected. Mara stood at the kitchen door without coming in. The quality of her stillness was different from Caleb's. His was patient, hers was held. "Those accounts are private," she said. "Yes." Evelyn looked up. "Caleb's private business, which he asked me to review. If you have a concern about that, it's worth raising with him directly." "I'm raising it with you, I understand." She set the pen down. "What would you like to know?" Mara came 3 steps into the kitchen and stopped again. Her hands were at her sides, and her chin was up in that way she had when she was preparing for something. "Why are you doing all of this?" Mara said. "All of what?" "The accounts, the kitchen, the garden, the children." She said children in a particular way, slightly harder, which was the tell. "You've been here barely 3 weeks. You don't know these people." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I know Eli is eating again. I know Sadie sleeps through the night now instead of waking up twice. I know your brother has not had a full meal prepared for him at a reasonable hour in months, possibly longer. And I know that the household accounts have been bleeding money quietly for the better part of a year, and nobody had the time to find it." She picked up her pen. "That's quite a bit to know in 3 weeks." Mara's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Evelyn said more quietly. "I don't know who I might be replacing. I don't know enough about what this household was before to replace it. I'm just..." She paused, looking for the right word. "I'm filling what I can see that needs filling. If that bothers you, I'm sorry. I don't know how else to do this." The silence was long enough that Evelyn picked up her pen again and returned to the accounts, because she had found that sometimes the most disarming thing she could do was simply continue working. "Kept the accounts," Mara said. "Clara, my brother's wife, before she got sick." A pause. She was very good at it. She had a head for numbers. Evelyn stopped writing. "The children's mother," she said. "Yes." Another silence. "She sounds like she was capable," Evelyn said carefully. She was. Mara's voice had a quality in it. Now that was something different from hostility, something older than hostility, and more painful. She was capable of most things. She stopped. Seemed to reconsider. She was good for this family. When both of them went, Caleb he ran the ranch. He kept it running. But the house, she looked around the kitchen. He didn't know what to do with the house. "No," Evelyn said. "It shows. It came out without cruelty, just factually." And Mara looked at her, and then, very unexpectedly, something in her face loosened just slightly, not a smile, not even close to a smile, but the faint, involuntary softening of someone who has been braced for the wrong thing. "It was a mess," Mara said. "I tried, I'm not." She looked at her hands. "I can manage a lot of things. Cooking and housekeeping are not among them." "That's not a character flaw," Evelyn said. "It's just a skill set. You either had reason to learn it or you didn't." Clara said something similar. Mara said it quietly, like she wasn't entirely sure she was going to. She said, "I had other skills, and she had these ones, and between us we had what the family needed." A long pause. "I thought that was just her being generous." "Maybe it was both," Evelyn said. "Generous and true." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled a chair out and sat down at the table, not across from Evelyn, but at the corner, which put them at an angle to each other rather than facing off. "Show me what you found in the accounts," she said. Evelyn turned the ledger so they could both see it. The overcharging at Haggerty's General Store turned out to be more complicated than a simple arithmetic error. This became apparent when Evelyn went through the receipts from the previous 2 years and found the same pattern recurring at specific intervals, always on large flour orders, always inflated by the same margin, always with receipts that had been written slightly differently from the store's standard format. She didn't say anything until she was certain. Being wrong about something like this was worse than saying nothing, and she was careful by nature careful, in the way people who have been dismissed too often learn to be, because being right was the only protection she'd ever had. She laid it out for Caleb on a Sunday evening, at the kitchen table, with the receipts arranged in order, her notes written cleanly beside them. He sat across from her and read through it twice. His face, as he read, was very still. "This started 8 months ago," he said. "Yes. Right around when Mr. Haggerty took on a new assistant. A man named," she checked her notes, "Dale Pruitt. No relation to Mrs. Pruitt, as far as I know." "I know Dale Pruitt," Caleb said. His voice had a specific flatness that she was beginning to recognize as the sound he made when he was controlling something he would prefer to express more directly. He worked for a man in Billings who lost his business under circumstances nobody was ever entirely clear on. "I see. How much total?" she told him. He sat very still for a moment. "Over 8 months," she said. "If it continues at the same rate for another year." "I know what the number becomes," he said. "I can write the letter to Haggerty if you'd prefer, or document it formally if you want to go to the marshal." He looked at her. "You'd write the letter. It's not complicated. I've caught overcharging before at the Hartley house, twice from different suppliers. The language just needs to be specific and clear, and not give them room to call it a misunderstanding." She straightened the receipts into a stack. "Or you can handle it however you prefer. This is your business. I just found the problem." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving against the north side of the house, and the lamp on the table was doing that thing lamps did in drafty rooms, not quite flickering, just breathing slightly, a slow pulse. "Why do you do that?" he said. "Do what? Pull back. Every time you do something you add, it's your business, or however you prefer, or I just found it. Like you need to make sure I know you're not overstepping." Evelyn looked at the table, at the receipts she'd just stacked. "Because I have overstepped," she said, "in other situations. And I've learned that it costs more than the alternative." "What happened? Which time?" He looked at her. "The worst one." A silence. She folded her hands on the table. "The Hartley house," she said. "The 2nd year. I found a problem with the household accounts not overcharging, something worse. The family's solicitor was skimming from a trust account set up for the children's education. I documented it. I brought it to Mr. Hartley directly." She paused. "He thanked me, handled it. The solicitor was dismissed. And for the next 10 years I was the most trusted person in that household." She looked at her hands. "Right up until I wasn't needed anymore." Caleb said nothing. "So I learned," Evelyn said, "that being right and being trusted are not the same as being secure. And I try to be useful without forgetting that I am here at someone else's invitation." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the lamp did that breathing thing again, and somewhere outside Dewey's horse shifted in the barn, and the house settled slightly against the wind. "Write the letter," Caleb said. "Whatever language you think is right. I'll sign it and we'll send it Monday." She nodded. "And Evelyn." He waited until she looked up. "You're not here at my invitation anymore. You're here because you belong here. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "Just a moment. Let's see about the letter," she said. "We can argue about the rest later." The flour she began baking with was different from what she was used to. She'd known it would be. The milling in Montana Territory was nothing like the fine eastern flour she'd worked with in the Hartley house, and the regional grain had a different protein content that behaved differently with yeast and differently, again, with the sourdough starter she'd been nursing back to full strength. She had spent the first week learning the flour's personality, how it absorbed water, how quickly the gluten developed, how the crust formed in the particular heat of the Rourke Ranch stove. She made notes on a small paper she tucked inside the tin recipe box, adding to the accumulated record of 100 adjusted techniques for 100 different kitchens. By the 4th week, she was producing bread that was not quite like what she'd made before, but was specifically right for this kitchen in this place, and that specificity was a kind of progress she valued more than consistency. Eli had started requesting particular things. This was the development that affected her most, though she tried not to show it. In the first week, He ate what was put in front of him with a kind of careful neutrality, grateful, she thought, or at least no longer resistant, but not yet connected to the food as something he actually wanted. Then came the day he asked if there was more broth. And then a few days later, watching her bake, he asked if the bread could be served with the beans the way it had been 2 nights ago, because that combination was good. And then he began turning up in the kitchen at odd hours, not asking for anything, just watching, which was how she recognized that he was the kind of person who processed the world through paying attention to it, started narrating what she was doing. Not for his benefit. Explicitly, she didn't say, "I'll explain this to you," or anything that would make it a lesson, because she'd learned that Eli received things better when they weren't pointed at him directly. She just talked about what she was doing while she did it, and he listened while pretending to be interested in something else. "Why do you put the salt in after the starter?" he asked one morning, from his position leaning against the far counter. "Because salt slows the yeast. If you put it in too early, it inhibits the fermentation. You want the starter to work first, then you add the salt to control the rate. Turn this over. So you're slowing it down on purpose. You're shaping it. There's a difference between slowing something and managing it." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that about horses." It was the first time he'd mentioned his father. She kept her hands on the dough, kept her rhythm, didn't look at him. "He was right," she said. "Same principle." Eli said nothing more, but he stayed in the kitchen until the bread went into the oven, and when it came out, he was the first one to the table. Caleb started showing up in the kitchen more. This was something Evelyn noticed, but did not address directly, because she was not sure what she thought about it, and she had learned over the years that the best response to something you're not sure about is to wait and get sure. He had taken to coming in for coffee in the morning, when she was already working. He had always done this. That wasn't new, but he was staying longer. He'd been sitting at the table with his coffee and his newspaper that he only intermittently read, asking her things while she worked or answering questions she asked him about the ranch operations that were relevant to her kitchen planning. She asked him about the ranch because she needed to know it, what livestock they had, and when the beef animals were scheduled, and what the slaughter yield typically was, and when the root cellars needed restocking, and what the supply line looked like coming into winter. These were not conversation. They were information gathering, and she asked them plainly, and he answered plainly, and it was efficient. But somewhere in the efficiency, something else had been happening that she was tracking in her peripheral vision without looking at it directly. He had started watching her the way she watched the bread, with the focused, patient attention of someone trying to understand how something worked. Not predatorily, nothing like that. It was more the watching of a man who had organized his world around things he could measure: cattle weight, feed costs, weather patterns, land value, and had encountered something that didn't fit his existing measurement system and was working on developing a new one. She noticed. She said nothing. She was not a woman who managed other people's feelings for them. She had done it in 15 years of household management for more families than she could remember, and she had learned that it didn't help anyone, not the people whose feelings she managed and not herself. Whatever was forming in Caleb Rourke's mind could form at its own rate, and she would wait for it to become something nameable before she decided what to do about it. In the meantime, she had the kitchen and the garden, and the children, and the accounts, and the steadily failing fence along the north pasture that Dewey kept mentioning to Caleb, and Caleb kept meaning to get to, and about 400 other things that needed attending to. He was not bored. The crisis, when it came, was not dramatic. It never was. In her experience, the things that actually tested a household were rarely the things people expected. It was a Thursday in early November, and it had been cold since the night before, in a way that felt like the first real announcement of what winter was actually going to be. Evelyn had been up before 4 because she'd heard something in the cold box that didn't sound right, and she'd gone to check and found that the temperature had dropped enough to freeze the pipe feeding the kitchen's water supply. Not burst, thank God, or whatever ran things in Montana, because a burst pipe in November on a ranch 3 miles from town was a specific kind of disaster she did not want to learn how to manage. She'd dealt with this before. Frozen pipes responded to gradual heat. You did not pour boiling water on them. You warmed them slowly from the supply end and let the ice melt through. She got the fire in the stove up high, got water she'd stored in the indoor bucket. She always kept an indoor bucket, because she had lived in enough cold climate houses to understand that indoor water storage in November was not paranoia but prudence, and got a system going. By the time Caleb came downstairs at 6, she had the pipe thawed, the kitchen at a workable temperature, and coffee on. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and at the arrangement of cloths she'd used, and the bucket and the slightly different smell of the room, the mineral smell of water that's been forced to move. Pipe, he said. Not burst. It's fine now. He came into the kitchen and looked at the pipe housing. She had wrapped it in cloth she'd heated on the stove and tied it with twine, not a permanent solution, but a solution for now. That needs proper insulation before the real cold sets in, she said. Dewey would know the right material. I know the material. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've been meaning to do it. I know. She handed him a cup of coffee. Now you've run out of time for meaning to. He took the cup, looked at her. The kitchen was still warm from the work of the morning, and her hair had come half out of its pins from crouching behind the pipe housing, and she was aware that she probably looked like someone who had been awake since 4 dealing with a plumbing problem. Because she was someone who had been awake since 4 dealing with a plumbing problem. Do you sleep? He asked. When nothing breaks, she said. Insulate the pipe today. He went and got Dewey, and they had the pipe properly wrapped by mid-morning. She made note of it in the household log. She'd started keeping the record of repairs made, problems found, supplies running low, things that needed attention before winter settled in fully. Kept it in the tin box with the recipes, because the tin box went with her, and she had learned not to keep important things in places that couldn't. That afternoon, Mara came into the kitchen while Evelyn was making the soup for supper, and stood at the table, looking at the household log she'd left open. You keep a record, Mara said. Of everything. Evelyn stirred the pot. Repairs, the children's meals, the account adjustments. If something goes wrong, there's a record of what was done and when. Clara kept something like this. Mara sat down slowly, pulling the log toward her, turned a page. She called it the household Bible. Caleb used to tease her about it. It saved me twice in previous positions, Evelyn said. Once when a supplier disputed an order I'd made, and I had the date and the amount written down. And once when a family member disputed a decision I'd made about the household, and I could show exactly what had happened and why. Mara was quiet, reading through the log entries, with the focused attention she brought to everything. You wrote down what Eli ate, Mara said, her voice changing slightly. Each day. So I can see if something changes. If he stops eating again, or if certain things work better than others. Evelyn glanced at her. It's not surveillance. It's just information. Mara turned another page. Stopped. You wrote that the window in the kitchen needs reglazing before December, and that the north fence posts are failing, and that the cold box should be moved to the interior wall before January. She looked up. Caleb see this? Some of it. I've mentioned the window. I haven't had the right moment for the cold box. He won't think of it himself. He runs the ranch very well, Mara said, in a tone that suggested she was being fair. Good with the land and the animals and the money. The house, he couldn't see it. Until someone else saw it, Evelyn said. That's not unusual. People can't always see what they're closest to. Mara set the log down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Evelyn. She would have liked you, she said. Clara. She said it carefully, like she was checking the weight of the words before committing to them. She liked capable people. She had no patience, for she used to say that helplessness was a choice, not a condition. She was not always kind about it. Sounds like someone I could argue with, Evelyn said. Something moved across Mara's face. Not quite a smile, but something that had been in the same room as a smile once. She would have argued with you, Mara said. She was good at it. So am I, Evelyn said. The soup needed stirring. She turned back to the stove. Behind her she could hear Mara picking up the log again, turning pages, and the kitchen settled back into its particular quiet fire, and pot, and the sound of the wind beginning outside against a house that was, slowly, becoming something more than a house that had gone dark. It was Sadie who said what no one else had managed to say yet. They were in the garden, the last week of November, bringing in what was left before the ground froze hard. Sadie was helping, which meant she was mostly carrying one potato at a time to the basket, with both hands and enormous concentration, treating each one like a small, significant treasure. Evelyn was working the row with a fork, turning the soil and collecting what was left, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Her hands were dirty to the wrist, and her back was beginning to register its opinion of the work. But the root cellar was going to be better stocked than it had been in years, and she found it difficult to be too unhappy about a thing while she could see the evidence of it in front of her. Evelyn, Sadie said. Are you going to marry Uncle Caleb? Evelyn's fork paused in the soil for just a beat before continuing. It's not something I know, she said. He looks at you different, Sadie said, with the extraordinary directness of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned the social value of circumspection. Different how? Sadie set her potato in the basket and picked up another one and looked at it, like when he's looking at the north pasture and he's deciding something. She thought about this, but with his inside face, not his outside one. Evelyn looked at the child. His inside face. He has 2 faces. The outside one is for everybody. The inside one is for when he's actually thinking. Sadie carried her potato to the basket. He uses the inside one for you. Evelyn turned another fork of soil and did not answer for a moment. You're very observant, she said. Mrs. Pruitt says I'm nosy, Sadie said cheerfully. Mrs. Pruitt is not wrong. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, the bare rows, the dark soil, the evidence of what had been grown there, and the beginning of what would come back in spring. We should get the rest of these in before dark. Sadie nodded seriously and went back to carrying potatoes, one at a time, with enormous care. Evelyn kept working. The cold moved in around her, and the light was going thin and low and golden across the ridge, and the ranch house behind her was lit from the inside, warm and specific, and from where she knelt in the dirt, she could see the kitchen window and the faint movement of shadow across it. Eli, inside, probably, doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table the way he'd started doing in the last 2 weeks, close to the heat of the stove. She had not answered Sadie's question. She was not sure she could answer it yet. There were too many things she didn't know, too many ways this still could go, too many versions of the future that were possible. She had been wrong about futures before. She had planned on them before and had them disappear. She knew better than to hold one too tightly. But she was still there. That was something. She was still there. And the children were eating, and the kitchen was running, and the accounts were straight, and the pipes were insulated, and in the spring, the garden would come up with whatever she'd planted in it. She dug the last of the potatoes out of the ground and put them in the basket and stood up and pressed her hands against the small of her back. Come on, she said to Sadie. Let's get inside before we both freeze. Sadie picked up the basket with both hands, straining against its weight, and refused the help Evelyn offered, because she had decided she was carrying it herself, and that was that. Evelyn walked beside her toward the house. December came to Blackwater Ridge the way it always did, without apology and without warning, even when you'd been watching for it. The first real snow fell on a Wednesday night, and by Thursday morning had buried the garden plot to the top of the raised bed frames, turned the irrigation channel into a pale seam in the white, and piled against the east wall of the house in a drift that reached the windowsill. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had, for once, gotten ahead of the weather. Pipes were insulated. The root cellar was full. Cold box had been moved to the interior wall in mid-November after she'd raised it with Caleb, and he'd organized Dewey to do it in a single morning. The wood stacks on the porch were deep enough to last 6 weeks, if she was careful, 8 if she was disciplined. She had not beaten the Montana winter. Nobody beat the Montana winter, but she had prepared for it, which was as much as anyone could reasonably claim. The children were different by December. Not transformed, she was suspicious of transformation, which implied something sudden and complete, and real change was never sudden or complete, but different. Eli had put on weight that showed in his face first, the hollowness around his eyes filling in slowly, his jaw looking less sharp. He still had the watchful quality, the careful neutrality of a child who had learned to protect himself from disappointment, but there were cracks in it now, small ones, moments where he forgot to be guarded. He laughed at something Dewey said, at the supper table one evening. A quick, involuntary laugh that he immediately tried to contain, but it was out before he caught it, and Evelyn had turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her notice it. Sadie had stopped asking when people were leaving. This was the thing Evelyn counted. Not the meals consumed or the weight gained or the color coming back into their faces, though she counted those too. She counted the day Sadie stopped asking. It had been a Tuesday, the week before the snow, and Evelyn hadn't realized it was happening until she looked back later and understood that the question had simply stopped coming, replaced by other questions about the bread, about the garden, about whether they could keep chickens in the spring, because Sadie had strong opinions about chickens. The household had a rhythm now. She had built it the way she built everything, incrementally, practically, without announcing what she was doing. Meals at consistent times. the kitchen warm before anyone else woke up. The accounts updated weekly. The household log kept current. Small things repeated reliably, until they became the structure that everything else rested on. What she had not built, and what she was not entirely sure she could build, was the thing that existed between her and Caleb in the space the kitchen table occupied in the evenings. He had started staying after supper. Not immediately in the first weeks he'd finished eating and gone back to whatever the ranch required, which was always something, the endless operational demands of a working cattle operation in winter preparation. But sometime in November, he had begun staying at the table after the children were in bed, with his coffee, and occasionally a ledger he was working through, and she would be at the stove or the table finishing the day's last tasks, and they would talk. Not about anything momentous mostly. Ranch business, supply planning, the letter they'd sent to Haggerty's that had resulted in a stilted but complete acknowledgement of the discrepancy and a credit on the account, and the quiet departure of Dale Pruitt from his position at the store. They talked about Eli's schoolwork, which was improving, and about the question of whether a tutor might be worth the expense, which led to a longer conversation about the territorial school system and its limitations, and a brief, spirited disagreement about whether book learning or practical knowledge was more valuable in a place like Montana that ended without resolution, because they were both right and both knew it. He had a mind that worked in straight lines, she discovered. He thought in terms of cause and effect, problem and solution, cost and yield. This was not a limitation, it was very useful for running a cattle ranch. And he ran as well, but it meant that he sometimes moved past things too quickly, filing them underhandled before they were fully resolved, because resolution and management were different, and he occasionally confused the two. She told him this. On an evening in late November, about something entirely unrelated to the two of them personally, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, with a directness she'd come to recognize as one of his better qualities, "You're right. I do that. Most people don't admit it," she said. "Most people haven't had it pointed out as clearly." She considered this. "Am I too direct?" "No." He turned his cup between his hands. "My mother was direct. My brother's wife was direct. I'm used to it. I married," he stopped. Corrected himself. "I almost married a woman from Helena who was not direct. It lasted about 4 months before we both understood it was a bad idea." This was the most he'd said about his personal history in one stretch, and she didn't press it. She had learned that he gave information when he decided to and not before, and that pressing produced nothing except his particular quality of silence. "What happened?" she said. "Just that. Not pushing, just leaving the door open." She wanted Caleb Rourke the rancher, he said. Caleb Rourke the man was a disappointment. "I work too much. I don't talk enough, and I apparently have no capacity for social functions." He said it without bitterness, which meant he'd made his peace with it a long time ago. She married a banker in Helena the following spring. "By all accounts, she's very happy." "Good for her," Evelyn said. He glanced at her. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it. She wanted something specific and found it, and it worked out. That's a good outcome." She set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the stovetop. Better than marrying the wrong person to avoid the awkwardness of not marrying them. He looked at her for a moment. "Is that what you think this is?" She looked back at him. "What?" "The agency arrangement. The mail order." He stopped. "I want to be honest with you about something. I went to the agency because it was efficient. I needed someone who could manage the household, and I thought I was practical about it, in a way that I'm not certain was fair to you." "You were practical about a practical problem," she said. "I was also being practical. I needed a stable situation and a household to run. Agency was the mechanism." She looked at him. "That's not the worst foundation for something." "No," he said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. "What I mean is it hasn't stayed practical." The lamp did its breathing thing. Outside, the wind moved against the north wall. Evelyn picked up her cloth and turned back to the stove. "I know," she said. She did not say more, and he did not push it. But the thing that had been unnamed between them had been named now, a little, and they both knew it had been named, and the kitchen settled around that fact, with the quiet of a house that has heard something true. The trouble arrived in December, carried on the stage from Billings, in the person of a man named Gerald Whitmore. She didn't know who he was when she first saw him. She was in town on a Thursday. She had started making the supply run herself, partly because it was more efficient, and partly because she wanted to know the town, its people, its rhythms, and she was at the counter in Haggerty's new arrangement. working through the weekly list, when she saw him come out of the land office across the street. He was a well-dressed man for Blackwater Ridge, which was to say he was wearing a coat that hadn't spent a winter on a ranch and boots that had been polished recently. He had a lawyer's walk, the specific measured confidence of a man who believes that whatever room he is walking toward will rearrange itself around his arrival. He stood on the porch of the land office for a moment and looked up and down the main street with the assessing proprietary expression of someone taking stock of something they intend to acquire. She noticed him the way she noticed most things completely, without appearing to. She found out who he was that afternoon from Mrs. Pruitt, who had heard it from the wife of the harness maker, who had heard it from someone at the boarding house. Gerald Whitmore was a land agent from Billings, representing an investment group out of Chicago. He had been in the territory before 6 months ago, briefly, and now he was back for longer. He had meetings scheduled with 3 ranchers in the valley. One of them was Caleb Rourke. She said nothing when she heard this, finished the supply run, loaded the wagon, and drove back to the ranch, and she did not say anything at supper. She was not in the habit of delivering information she hadn't verified, and she was not certain what Whitmore's business with Caleb was, or whether it was any of her concern. Put it in the back of her mind and kept it there. It stayed there for 4 days. Caleb mentioned Whitmore himself on a Sunday evening. In the way he mentioned things, he was still working out, not leading with it, but arriving at it through conversation, the way you arrive at a destination, by walking rather than being carried there. "I have a meeting in town Tuesday," he said. "Land business. There's a man out of Billings who wants to discuss water rights." Evelyn kept her eyes on the log she was updating. "Whitmore." He looked at her. "You know him?" "I know of him. I was in town Thursday when he came out of the land office. Mrs. Pruitt told me what she'd heard." She looked up. "What does he want?" "He's representing an investment group that's been buying up water rights in the valley. They want to offer me a payment for rights to the East Creek." He said it flatly, already slightly uncomfortable with the words. "It's a fair offer on paper, and off paper." He picked up his coffee cup and turned it, set it back down. "The East Creek is the primary water source for the summer pasture. Without those rights, in a dry summer, you can't run cattle on the summer pasture. Not effectively. And if you can't run cattle there, then the productive capacity of the ranch drops by about a third." He said it quietly, "which makes the ranch much easier to buy at a lower price." Evelyn set her pen down. "He's not buying water rights." "No, he's buying leverage." She looked at him. "Have other ranchers sold?" "2. The Brennan place east of here sold 6 months ago, and Brennan's moved his herd to a smaller pasture. He told me last month that he's thinking about whether to hold on through another season." He rubbed the side of his jaw. "Whitmore's been at this for a while. He knows what he's doing." "Do you have documentation of your water rights?" "Filed with the Territorial Land Office." "I have copies. Let me see them." He looked at her. "Not to manage your business," she said. "To understand the language. Legal documents about water rights have specific terminology, and the terms matter. I've read enough household contracts and supply agreements to know that what's written and what people assume is written are often different things." She picked up her pen. "Let me see the documentation before your meeting Tuesday." He brought her the documents that evening, a folder of papers from the land office, territorial filings going back to his father's time, the original claim documents, the survey maps. She sat with them at the kitchen table for 2 hours after everyone else had gone to bed, reading carefully, making notes in the margin of her household log. What she found was not what she was expecting. The water rights document was sound on the main creek that was filed clearly and correctly, the Rourke claim predating any competing interest by 15 years. But there was a secondary filing, much older, for a seasonal tributary that fed into the East Creek in spring and early summer. The filing was in the name of Rourke, but it was filed under the father's first name, and there was a notation from the Territorial Land Office, dated 8 years ago, requesting clarification on the inheritance transfer that appeared to have never been answered. It was not a gap that made the rights invalid, but it was the kind of gap that a good lawyer could use to create uncertainty, and uncertainty was often enough in legal matters and financial ones to make a person accept worse terms than they should. She sat at the table with the lamp and the documents and her notes and thought about Gerald Whitmore's polished boots and his lawyer's walk, and the way he'd stood on that porch looking up and down the street like he was calculating something. She was very still for a long time. Then she wrote out a clean summary of what she'd found, what it meant, and what she thought needed to be done before Tuesday's meeting. In the careful, specific language she'd used to document the Hartley household accounts, and the Haggerty overcharges the language of someone who understood that the value of a document was in its precision. She put it inside the tin box with the recipes. In the morning before Caleb came downstairs, she took it out and put it on the table beside his coffee cup. He read it standing up, still in his coat from the morning barn check, with his hat in his hand and his coffee going cold on the table beside him. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stood there looking at it. The tributary filing, he said, is an open question. It may be nothing a clerical issue, easily resolved. But if Whitmore's lawyers have done what lawyers like that do, they've already found it. And they'll use it to argue that your water rights to the tributary are in dispute, which gives them grounds to claim the offer. For the creek rights is actually more generous than it appears because you may not have full standing on the tributary, which means the summer pasture water supply is effectively compromised either way, unless you get the inheritance transfer clarified before the meeting. She wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. I don't know if that's possible in 2 days. It may require a trip to Helena. I have a lawyer in Helena. He picked up the document and read it a third time, more slowly. How did you find this? I read the documents. She looked at him. I read everything carefully. It's the only way I know how to read things. He set the document down on the table and stood there for a moment in that particular quality of stillness he had. And then he looked at her, not the way he'd been looking at her lately, the careful, considering look she'd been tracking in her peripheral vision. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been underestimating and have just fully understood. When did you do this? He said. Last night, after everyone was in bed. You stayed up. The lamp was already lit. He was quiet for a long moment. Then Evelyn. Yes. I need to send a wire to Helena this morning. I know, she said. I wrote out the summary so you could include the specific filing details in the wire. It's easier than trying to describe it. He picked up the summary she'd written, looked at it, looked at her. What do I owe you? He said. It came out gravel, Ralph, which was how his voice sounded when he was feeling something he didn't have words for yet. Fair cup of coffee and an insulated kitchen pipe, she said. We're even. He left for town within the hour. She watched the wagon go up the approach road from the kitchen window, and then she turned back to the stove because Eli and Sadie would be down soon and the bread wasn't going to make itself. The meeting with Whitmore happened on Tuesday as scheduled. She didn't go. It wasn't her meeting and she didn't pretend it was. But Caleb told her about it that evening, at the kitchen table, after supper and after the children were in bed, in the specific, deliberate way he was beginning to tell her things, as if she were a person who deserved the accurate version, not the simplified one. His lawyer had reached the Territorial Land Office in Helena by wire and gotten an expedited clarification on the inheritance transfer. It had taken the better part of Monday and a moderately unreasonable fee, but it was done. The tributary rights were now clearly and correctly filed under Caleb's name. The gap was closed. Whitmore had arrived at the meeting Tuesday morning with a folder of documents that Caleb said probably included the same filing discrepancy Evelyn had found. He'd made his offer politely, reasonably, with the measured confidence of a man who believed he held better cards than he was showing. Caleb had laid the corrected filing on the table. Whitmore had looked at it. He was very professional about it, Caleb said. He thanked me for my time and said the offer would remain available if I changed my mind and left. He turned his coffee cup. He also left a lot faster than he'd arrived. He'll try someone else, Evelyn said. He'll try Brennan. Brennan sold the tributary rights 3 months ago. He set the cup down. I talked to Brennan last week. He didn't know what he was giving up. He thought it was a separate thing. Is there anything he can do? At this point, probably not. The filing is done. He looked at the table. I'm going to talk to the other ranchers in the valley, the ones Whitmore hasn't approached yet or hasn't closed on, so they know what to look for. She nodded. That was your idea, he said. You didn't say it, but that's what you were thinking. It doesn't help you to be the only one standing if everyone around you falls, she said, and a healthy valley is better for the ranch than an isolated one. He looked at her. My brother used to say something similar, he said, about the community of ranchers out here, that you supported your neighbors because the land was hard enough without making enemies of the people who understood it the way you did. He sounds like he was a sensible man. He was. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was better with people than I am. He walked into a room and it got easier. I walk into a room and it get quieter, Evelyn said. He glanced at her. That's not a criticism, she said. Some rooms need quieting. He didn't answer, but something in his face shifted slightly, a small private adjustment, the kind that happened when something landed in a place that wasn't defended against it. Mara had been watching all of this. She had been watching it since the beginning, with the careful, skeptical attention of a woman who had seen her brother's life complicated more than once and was not interested in seeing it complicated again. She had moved through stages, first open hostility, then reluctant observation, then the grudging respect that had come out sideways in the conversation about Clara and the household accounts. She was not a woman who moved quickly from one position to another. She had a particular stubbornness that was almost entirely unlike Caleb's. His was deep and quiet. Hers was articulate and defended. What shifted it, in the end, was not anything dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December when she came into the kitchen and found Evelyn teaching Eli to make biscuits. Not because Eli had asked. He hadn't asked. Evelyn had simply been making them, and he'd been at the table doing his schoolwork, and she'd handed him a portion of the dough and said, "Press it flat with the heel of your hand." Like this, and he'd done it with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. And they were working side by side at the board. Eli's less practiced hands beside Evelyn's wide, flour-dusted one, and Eli was not watching her with his guarded expression. He was concentrating. He was present, in the way that Mara had not seen him present since before his parents died, not the watchful, enduring presence of a child waiting for the next loss, but the absorbed, current presence of someone who is actually in the moment they're in. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched for a moment without them noticing her. Then she went and sat at the kitchen table, and she picked up a piece of the dough, and she said, "Show me too." Evelyn looked at her. Mara met her eyes. There was nothing in her expression that was going to be called anything. No word was going to be said, no thing acknowledged. She was simply sitting at the table with dough in her hand, waiting to be shown. "Press it flat with the heel of your hand," Evelyn said. "Not too hard. You want to flatten it, not work it." Mara pressed, did it again. Eli looked at her aunt's biscuit and then at his own, with the critical comparison of a 9-year-old who has decided he is, in this particular area, more experienced. "Mine is more even," he said. "You've had more practice," Mara said. "I am a beginner." She said it without difficulty, which was interesting, because Mara said very few things without difficulty. They made biscuits, all three of them. Kitchen smelled like flour and rendered fat, and the particular dry warmth of a well-stoked stove in winter. And outside the snow had started again, soft and steady, against a house that was, this winter, not empty. It was Dewey who told her about the Brennan family. He mentioned it on a Thursday morning while she was bringing feed to the kitchen garden frames. She'd been packing straw around the raised beds to protect them through the worst of the winter cold, and he was doing something to the fence post nearest the garden that he did not particularly need to do, but that gave him a reason to be nearby. "Brennan's wife came to town yesterday," Dewey said to the fence post. "She was asking at the boarding house about rooms." Evelyn stopped what she was doing. "They're not listing the ranch yet," he said. "But you know how it goes." She did know how it went. She had seen it before, not ranches, but households, the quiet preliminary steps before a family acknowledged what they'd already decided. The checking of alternatives, the asking of cautious questions that weren't quite commitments. "How many children do they have?" she said. 3. Youngest is about 4. She straightened up from the garden frame, looked at the ridge. The snow was falling lightly, the particular fine, dry snow of established winter, not the heavy wet snow of the first storms. "Caleb's been talking to the Valley ranchers," she said. "About Whitmore?" "Yes, ma'am." Dewey pulled at the fence post, testing it, though it was perfectly solid. "The Brennans might be a harder situation. The water rights are already sold. Is there anything to be done about that legally?" Dewey was quiet for a moment. "I don't know much about law." "Neither do I," she said. "But I know someone who might." She finished the garden frames and went inside and wrote a letter to Caleb's lawyer in Helena. Not on Caleb's behalf, she was clear about that. On her own behalf, asking a factual question about the legal standing of water rights transactions, where one party may not have had complete information about what they were selling. She paid the postage herself, from the small amount she'd been setting aside from the household budget, with Caleb's knowledge and without discussion. She did not mention it at supper. She did not mention it the following week, when the lawyer's reply came, addressed to her, with a 3-paragraph answer that was more useful than she'd expected. She read it twice and put it in the tin box and thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she put it on the kitchen table beside Caleb's coffee and sat down across from him. He read it. He looked at her. "How much did this cost?" he said. "Not as much as losing the Brennan place would cost the Valley." He was quiet for a moment. "This is my business to I know." She looked at him. "But you were going to say I should have thought of this, and you're right. And we've moved past that part. Question now is whether the Brennans have legal recourse, and the answer is maybe, depending on what was to them before they signed." She folded her hands on the table, which means someone needs to sit down with the Brennans and look at what they signed and what they were told. You want to do that. I want to help. It's up to you how. He looked at the letter again. Then at her. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm not trying to run your ranch," she said, before he could find whatever he was looking for. "I'm trying to—" She stopped, looked at the table. "I'm trying to keep this valley from being hollowed out by someone from Billings who sees it as an asset, not a place." She looked up at him. "And I have time and I have attention, and those are things worth using." The thing on his face that had been building for weeks was closer to the surface now than it had ever been. She could see it. She looked away. "Talk to Brennan," she said. "Tell him we'll come out Saturday if he's willing to let us look at what he signed." He nodded. He left for the barn a few minutes later. She cleaned up the breakfast table and put the letter back in the tin box and went back to the kitchen, which had become the place where she thought most clearly, and she stood at the stove and let the warmth of it sit against her hands, and looked at the window and the snow and the ridge beyond it, and the particular, hard, beautiful country that had been someone's home for a long time and was, slowly, becoming something like hers. Caleb came back in from the cold that afternoon with something in his expression that had not been there in the morning. He came into the kitchen. He always came into the kitchen. She'd stopped noticing it as a specific thing and stood by the stove in his coat, thawing out, the way he did before he took it off. And he looked at her for a long moment with that inside face Sadie had described, the one he kept for when he was actually thinking. "What?" Evelyn said. "Nothing." He took his coat off, hung it on the peg by the door. "I talked to Brennan. He'll see us Saturday." "Good." He poured himself coffee and stood with it. Kitchen had that mid-afternoon quality, the early dark of December already coming in at the edges of the window, the stove working steady, Sadie's voice somewhere upstairs in the particular tonal pattern that meant she was talking to herself, or to a doll, or to some other entity that only she could see. "She asked me today," Caleb said. "Sadie, she asked if you were going to stay." Evelyn kept stirring the pot. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I hoped so." She turned from the stove and looked at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away, which was something he was doing more often now, holding the look rather than breaking it, as if he'd decided that looking away was a kind of dishonesty he wasn't willing to practice. "That's what I told her," he said. Evelyn turned back to the pot. "She'll want a more definitive answer eventually," she said. "I know," so was silence. Not uncomfortable. The specific silence of two people who have said the truest thing they know how to say at this moment and are letting it stand there between them without trying to cover it with anything else. "Saturday," Evelyn said. "We'll go to the Brennans." "Saturday," he said. She stirred the pot. He stood there with his coffee. Outside, the snow settled against the house, steady and patient, the way winter always settled, as if it had all the time in the world, which it did, and didn't mind at all that the house inside was warm. The Brennan place was 7 miles east of the Rourke Ranch, set in a shallow valley that caught the wind from 2 directions, and made no apologies for it. Evelyn had not been that far from the Rourke property since she'd arrived, and she noticed things on the drive that she hadn't been able to see from the approach road, or the town the way the valley floor changed from the Rourke land eastward, creek running lower than it should for December, the places along the bank, where the soil was disturbed in the particular way of recent survey work. Caleb noticed her noticing. "The survey markers," he said without her asking. "Whitmore's people put them in before he made the offer. I found 3 of them on the east pasture boundary last month. He was planning the acquisition before he made contact," she said. "He's been planning it longer than any of us knew." Caleb kept his eyes on the road, which required attention in December with the ruts frozen hard and unpredictably. The Brennan sale wasn't opportunistic. It was the first step. She held this information, the way she held most things that troubled her, quietly, turning it over, looking at what it connected to. The Brennan house was smaller than the Rourke place and showed it in the particular way of a house that had been adequate for a family for a long time. and was beginning to show the strain of a difficult year. Porch needed work. The barn door was hanging on a repaired hinge that was not going to last another season. These were not signs of a negligent family. They were signs of a family whose attention and resources had been elsewhere, which was different. Margaret Brennan met them at the door. She was a small, compact woman in her 40s, with the particular tiredness of someone managing 3 children through a hard winter on diminished resources, and she looked at Evelyn with a careful, measuring expression that Evelyn recognized immediately because she'd worn it herself on a stagecoach platform 2 months ago. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Then you must be Miss Mercer." "Evelyn, please," she extended her hand. "Thank you for having us." Margaret Brennan looked at her hand, and then shook it firmly and stepped back to let them in. Tom Brennan was at the kitchen table. He was a big, weathered man with a rancher's hands and a rancher's eyes, the particular eyes of someone who has spent too many seasons watching weather and markets and making calculations that don't always come out right. He stood when they came in and shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Evelyn and gestured at the chairs. "Coffee," Margaret said. It was not a question. She was already at the stove. They sat at the table. The kitchen was clean, but spare the pantry door was open at an angle, and Evelyn could see, without trying to see, that the shelves were not as full as they should have been in December. 2 of the 3 children appeared briefly in the doorway, were collected by some maternal gravity Evelyn couldn't see, and disappeared again. The third, the youngest, a girl of about 4, sat under the table with something she was working on seriously and did not acknowledge the visitors at all. Tom Brennan put the documents on the table. He slid them across to Evelyn without being asked, which told her that Caleb had prepared him for this, had told him that she was the one who would need to look at them, and that Brennan had accepted this without making it complicated. She was grateful for that, and for the fact that Caleb had not introduced her as his housekeeper, or his bride-to-be, or any of the other inexact categories that might have required explanation. She read slowly. She always read slowly when it mattered, because speed was the enemy of understanding in legal documents. They were designed, often, to reward slow reading and punish fast assumptions. What she found was not simple and not simple to explain. The water rights transfer document that Brennan had signed was not fraudulent. That was the first thing she established clearly in her own mind before she said anything, because claiming fraud was a serious thing, and she was not prepared to do it without certainty. The document was legal, properly filed, witnessed correctly. What it was incomplete in its disclosure. Specifically, Whitmore's representative had described the tributary rights being sold as a seasonal secondary flow, with no direct impact on primary ranch operations. This was technically accurate in the way that a description of a foundation crack as cosmetic settling was technically accurate true in the narrowest possible sense, and designed to be misunderstood. She looked at the survey map included in the filing. She looked at the seasonal flow notations. She looked at the dates. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "when they described these as a seasonal secondary flow, what did you understand that to mean?" He looked at his hands on the table. "I understood it meant spring runoff. Water that was extra in spring and dried up before summer anyway. That's what the man said, that we wouldn't miss it. In a normal rainfall year, that would be partially true." She turned the map so he could see what she was looking at. "In a dry year, and this territory has dry years, you know that better than I do this tributary is not secondary. It's the feeder that keeps the East Creek viable through July and August. Without it, in a dry summer, the East Creek drops to unusable," Brennan said. His voice had gone flat. "We had a dry summer in '78. I ran cattle off that pasture 3 weeks early. I always thought it was the heat." He was staring at the map. "It was the water. In a dry summer," Evelyn said carefully. "Not every year, but enough years that it matters." Kitchen was very quiet. Margaret Brennan set coffee cups on the table without saying anything and sat down at the corner of the table where she could see her husband's face. "He knew," Brennan said. "His people did the survey before they approached you," Caleb said. "They mapped the flow patterns. They had the rainfall data for the valley. They knew exactly what they were buying, and they described it in language that was designed to sound like less than it was." Brennan sat back in his chair. He was a large man, and the movement had the quality of something deflating, not collapse. Nothing that dramatic, but the slow release of a man who has been holding something upright for months and has just been told that the thing he thought he was holding was not what he believed. "What can be done?" he said. Evelyn looked at the documents in front of her. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But the letter from Caleb's lawyer in Helena suggests that there may be a claim for material misrepresentation, not fraud. But misrepresentation, if the description given to you at the time of signing, can be shown to differ meaningfully from what was actually being transferred. She looked at him. Do you remember who was in the room when you signed? Is there anyone who heard what Whitmore's man said to you? Brennan looked at his wife. Margaret said I was there. And Haggerty, the younger one, the son. He witnessed the signing. Would he say what he heard? Margaret looked at her husband again. Something passing between that had the quality of a long marriage's shorthand. He might, she said carefully. He was uncomfortable. I remember thinking he was uncomfortable and not understanding why. Evelyn nodded. Made a note in the small book she had brought, not the household log. A separate notebook. Clean pages, just for this. I think, she said, you should write to the lawyer in Helena. Caleb can give you the name. Before you do anything else, before you talk to Whitmore again, before you make any decisions about the ranch, write to the lawyer. Tell him exactly what you've told us. Let him tell you what you have. Tom Brennan looked at her for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man reassessing something, running new numbers against an old calculation. Caleb said you found the problem with his water rights, he said. I read his documents, Evelyn said. I read carefully. That's all. That's not all, Brennan said. He said it without ceremony, just as a fact. That's quite a bit more than all. Margaret stood and went back to the stove with the efficiency of a woman who expresses care through action rather than words, and came back with a plate of something she set on the table without explanation. The something turned out to be cornbread, slightly uneven across the top in the way of bread made in a hurry or in a difficult oven. Evelyn took a piece and ate it and said, sincerely, that it was good because the texture was a little rough, but the flavor was correct and honest. Under the table, the 4-year-old had fallen asleep with her project across her chest. Nobody moved her. On the drive back to the Rourke ranch, the cold was deep and specific, the kind of December cold that had teeth in it, and Evelyn sat on the wagon bench with her coat buttoned to the chin and watched the road and thought about the Brennan kitchen and the half-full pantry shelves and Margaret Brennan's particular tired competence. She's been managing on less since the sale, she said. The money they got for the rights went to paying down debt. But she's been rationing. I know, Caleb said. Is there anything you can do? I've been thinking about that. He kept his eyes on the road. There's a section of winter grazing that Brennan used to use by informal agreement with my father, the South Meadow, below the ridge. It's not on Brennan's deed, but it's been his use for 20 years. I can formalize that. Give him documented access rights, no cost. It doesn't replace what he sold, but it gives him something stable. He'll accept it, he'll argue with it for about 20 minutes, and then accept it. A pause. Tom Brennan is a proud man, but he has 3 children, and he's practical enough to know when pride is a luxury. She nodded. And the lawyer? I'll write to Helena today. Cover the cost of the consultation myself. Brennan doesn't need to know that immediately. She looked at him. Don't, he said. Don't what? Look at me like you're about to say something polite about what I just said. She looked back at the road. I was going to say it's a decent thing to do. Practical thing to do, he said. If Whitmore gets the Brennan place, he's that much closer to controlling the valley's water structure. It's not generosity, it's self-interest. It can be both. He was quiet for a moment. My brother would have done it faster. He wouldn't have had to think about it. She considered that. Maybe. But you did do it. The speed is less important than the result. He didn't answer. The horses moved steadily through the cold, their breath making small clouds, the wagon wheels finding the frozen ruts and holding them. Above the ridge, the sky had the particular flat, pale quality of a sky considering more snow. You should move into the main bedroom, Caleb said. Turned and looked at him. He was still watching the road. The room you're in is the smallest on the upper floor, and the coldest, he said. The main bedroom has the chimney running through the east wall. It's warmer by 10 degrees at least. I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse office this winter. Anyway, I'm up and out before 4 most mornings, and there's no point in me being in the main house. Caleb, it's a practical arrangement, he said. The tips of his ears above the collar were slightly red. It might have been the cold. The room is warmer. You're up before the household. The chimney heat makes it easier to manage the morning temperature. She looked at him for another moment. All right, she said. All right. I'll move my things this week. There's no rush. I'll move them this week, she said again. Because she had learned that with Caleb Rourke, agreeing to a thing and then letting it sit indefinitely was a way of not agreeing to it, and she had decided that she was going to agree to this. He nodded. The horses kept moving. The cold kept doing what it was doing. "Thank you," she said. Not for the room. For something larger than the room, that she didn't have a better word for yet. He didn't say "you're welcome." He said "don't thank me," which, she had learned, was his way of saying the same thing. She moved her things on a Tuesday, which was a Mrs. Pruitt day, which meant Mrs. Pruitt was in the kitchen, and Evelyn had time in the middle of the day to carry her belongings from the small north-facing room to the main bedroom without making a production of it. The main bedroom was larger and warmer, as promised, with 2 windows and a proper wardrobe and a washstand that wasn't cracked. Chimney ran through the east wall and radiated a dry, steady heat that made the air in the room feel like something actively generous. There was a braided rug on the floor that had been there a long time, worn at the center. The colors faded to a comfortable blur, and a quilt on the bed that was patchwork in the old way, made from what was available, not designed but accumulated. She made 2 trips. Her satchels in the tin box and her few hang-in items and the small collection of books she'd brought from Cincinnati, a household management text she'd had for 15 years and barely needed anymore, 2 novels, and a medical reference she'd bought in Cheyenne when she'd realized Montana would not be close to a physician. On the second trip, she paused in the doorway of the old room and looked at it. It was a very small room. She had been cold in it for 2 months, and she had not complained about it because it was not her house, and it was not her room to complain about. But she had lain in that narrow bed on a great many mornings listening to the cold come up through the gap in the floorboards, and had thought things she had not said out loud, some of them practical, and some of them less so. She had thought about the 1,000 miles and the photograph and Mara's voice carrying across the platform. She had thought about the Hartley house and the 3 weeks' notice and the letter that came 12 years too late. She had thought, on some of those mornings, about what it meant to begin again at 34 in a cold room in Montana with a tin box and a satchel, and whether beginning again was a kind of resilience or just the absence of alternatives. She had not resolved that question. She was not certain it was the kind of question that resolved. Closed the door of the small room and went back downstairs. January brought 3 weeks of the kind of cold that stopped being weather and became a condition of existence, not something that happened to you, but something you lived inside of, that organized every decision around the single priority of staying warm and keeping what needed to stay alive. Evelyn had known cold winters. She had managed households through Illinois winters and Iowa winters and one terrible winter in Minnesota that had lasted, it seemed to her at the time, for most of human history. But Montana winter was different in its character, colder, yes, but also more honest, somehow. It did not sneak up on you. It was simply present, enormous and indifferent, and you either made your preparations and endured it or you did not. She had made her preparations. The household ran through January with the particular efficiency of a system that had been thought through before it was needed. Wood was stacked and accessible. The root cellar was organized by what would be needed first. Cold box was managed carefully. The temperature checked twice daily. The contents rotated to keep the oldest things in use. She had laid in flour and salt and dried beans and cornmeal enough for 3 months because she had asked Dewey in October how bad January could get, and he had told her, with his characteristic precision, "Pretty bad, ma'am," and she had bought accordingly. The children were healthy. This was the thing she checked first, every morning, not the fire, not the pipe, not the weather, but the children. Eli's appetite had normalized in a way that was now simply the baseline. He ate. He asked for more sometimes. He had preferences and expressed them with increasing confidence. He had put on enough weight that his clothes from the fall were already tight across the shoulders, which required a conversation with Mara about whether anything could be let out or whether new items were needed. Mara, who turned out to be a competent seamstress when she chose to be, dealt with it without fanfare. Sadie had begun calling her Evelyn with an E, which was apparently a distinction she'd developed after learning that there was another Evelyn, somewhere in Irvitsk, the wife of a rancher she'd met once. She explained and needed to differentiate. Evelyn with an E accepted this distinction without comment. The thing with Mara had continued its slow, improbable progress. They were not friends. Evelyn was not sure they would ever be exactly friends. Their personalities were too similar in the ways that created friction, and too different in the ways that made accommodation difficult. They had reached something more stable than tolerance, and more honest than politeness. They argued sometimes about the kitchen, about the children's routines, about a decision Caleb had made that they both had opinions about, and the arguments were direct and usually brief because neither of them had any taste for prolonged conflict. They also increasingly talked. The biscuit lesson in December had been followed by 2 more kitchen sessions that Mara had initiated, both under the guise of practical necessity and both something more than that. She was not a natural cook. She had no patience for the iterative failures that cooking required, but she was disciplined. And when she understood the logic of a technique, she could replicate it, which was more than many people managed. One evening in mid-January, Mara came into the kitchen after supper when the children were in bed. Caleb's in the barn, doing something that required him to be in the barn at 8 o'clock at night, and she sat down at the table and said, "He's going to ask you." Evelyn was working bread dough. She kept her hands moving. "He's been working up to it for about 3 weeks, Mara said. "I know what it looks like when he's working up to something. He gets very practical and very quiet, and he starts fixing things. He fixed the kitchen window last week," Evelyn said. "He rehung the barn door the week before, and he reset 2 fence posts that were perfectly adequate." Mara looked at her hands on the table. "He fixed everything he could think of, which means he's about to do something he can't fix if it goes wrong." Evelyn pressed the dough, folded it. "I wanted to tell you," Mara said, "before he does. Because I said things when you arrived that She stopped. The particular tight quality came into her jaw. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," Evelyn said. "I'm doing terribly. I'm sitting here at 9 o'clock in the evening talking about my brother's feelings, because I'm apparently the person who has to do this." She looked at the ceiling briefly, as if locating patience there. "What I mean to say is that I was wrong about you when you got off that stage. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong about 2 days in, and it took me considerably longer than 2 days to do anything useful with that information." Evelyn turned the dough. "I know that," she said. "I know you know." Mara looked at her. "He needs someone who can stand next to him. Not behind him and not in front of him. Next to him." He said. She stopped. "After Clara and his brother, he's been running this ranch like a man who doesn't believe in making plans that go more than 1 season forward. Because every time he's made a long plan, something has broken it." She paused. "You're the first thing he's let himself think forward about in 2 years." The dough was right. She covered it and set it aside to rise and washed her hands at the basin and sat down at the table across from Mara. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said. Mara looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure I'm not going anywhere. I'm not sure about everything else. I'm not sure I'll always get things right. I'm not sure we won't argue. I'm not sure I know what I'm doing any more than anyone else does." She looked at the table. "But I've been trying to leave since the day I arrived, and I keep not doing it. At some point that stops being a coincidence." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the particular dry precision that was her version of warmth, "That may be the most honest thing I've heard anyone say about staying somewhere." "I'm a direct person," Evelyn said. "Yes, I've noticed." Mara stood up. "He has his mother's ring. He's been carrying it in his coat pocket for 3 weeks. I know because I saw him put it there, and I've been watching him fidget with his coat pocket at supper every evening since." She left the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table in the quiet and looked at the covered dough on the board and the tin box on the shelf and the lamp doing its slow breathing, and she felt something that was not quite peace and not quite fear, and was probably both of those things mixed with something. She didn't have a name for the feeling of standing at the edge of a thing that is real. That will matter. That cannot be undone once it is stepped into. She was not afraid of it. She was perhaps the most unafraid she had been of anything in several years. He asked her on a Saturday in late January. Not in the kitchen, which was where she had half expected it, and not in the evening, which was when the conversations that mattered had mostly happened. He asked her in the late afternoon, in the garden, which was buried under 6 inches of snow and showed no evidence of ever having been a garden, while she was checking the straw packing on the raised bed frames that she checked every 2 weeks through winter to make sure the frost wasn't compromising them. She was crouched beside the east frame, pressing the straw into a gap that had opened, when she heard his boots in the snow behind her. She finished what she was doing before she stood up. She always finished what she was doing. When she turned, he was standing about 3 feet away with his hat in one hand and something in the other hand that he had not yet shown her. And he had an expression on his face that she had not seen before, not the outside face, not even the inside one that Sadie had described. Something else. The expression of a man who has thought carefully and seriously about something for a long time and has arrived, finally, at the moment when thinking stops being useful. I should have done this better, he said. I should have planned it better. He stopped. I don't do this well. I know, she said. Do it anyway. He opened his hand. The ring was small and gold and plain, with a single small stone that had the particular depth of something old. It had not been cleaned recently. It showed the honest wear of something that had been handled, kept, carried. It was my mother's, he said. She wore it for 40 years. He paused. She was a difficult woman, not always easy to be around. But she was the kind of person who made things work, even when they shouldn't have, even when nobody expected them to. He looked at Evelyn, thinking about that. The people who make things work. Evelyn looked at the ring in his hand. I'm not going to tell you I knew from the beginning, he said. I wasn't expecting you. He looked for words. I wasn't expecting to have to revise what I thought I was looking for. And I'm not someone who revises easily. No, she said. You're not. But I have. In the last 3 months he stopped. I have revised considerably. She looked at him, at the ring, at his face, which was doing something unguarded and slightly uncertain and entirely real. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know the ranch is hard and the winters are worse than you expected, and I work too much this year, and I don't always say the right thing. I know that. He paused. But I would try. He stopped again. I'm not good at this, Caleb, she said. Yes. You've been carrying that ring in your coat pocket for 3 weeks. He blinked. Howdy, he stopped, looked briefly at the sky. Mara. She also mentioned the fence posts. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile. Not yet, but close to the territory. Evelyn Mercer, he said. Will you stay? Not will you marry me? Not the formal question with its formal answer. Just will you stay? Which was both less and more than the formal version, less ceremonial, more true. Because staying was the actual thing, the real commitment, the choice made not once at an altar, but every day against the weight of every reason not to. She looked at him, at the ring, at the ridge behind him with the snow on it, and the sky above the ridge with the pale winter light in it, and the ranch house visible over his left shoulder, with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney because she had banked the fire before coming out here, and it was still working. Yes, she said. He didn't say anything. He put the ring on her finger carefully because his hands were large and her fingers were cold, and the fit required attention, and when it was on he held her hand in both of his for a moment, her hand disappearing inside his the way small things do inside very large ones. They stood in the snow, in the dead garden for a moment. We should go inside, she said. It's cold, he said. The children will want supper. Yes, neither of them moved immediately. Cold did what it always did. The smoke from the chimney went up in the still air in a straight, purposeful line. Then they went inside. Telling the children was not a ceremony. Evelyn had not expected it to be and had not wanted it to be, because ceremonies required a kind of performance that neither she nor Caleb was well suited to, and because Eli and Sadie deserved to be told as a plain fact and not a presentation. Caleb told them at supper. He said it the way he said most important things directly, without preamble, without softening. He said that he and Evelyn were going to get married, and that she was going to stay at the ranch. And then he picked up his fork and looked at his plate, which was his way of indicating that he had said what he needed to say, and they could respond however they needed to respond. Sadie looked at Evelyn. Then she got down from her chair and walked around the table and leaned against Evelyn's arm, which was the closest thing to an embrace that Sadie typically managed with someone she was still deciding about. She said, "Good." Just that, good. Then she climbed back into her chair and picked up her fork. Eli did not say anything immediately. He ate 2 bites of his supper with the careful deliberation of a 9-year-old processing information, and then he looked at Evelyn and said, "You'll still make the broth." It was not a question, but it was asking something. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'll still make the broth." He nodded once, with the decisive quality of someone who has resolved a concern and is ready to move forward, and went back to his supper. Mara, who had been at the table for this entire exchange, with the expression of someone who knew what was coming and was watching how it landed, said nothing at all. She simply looked at Evelyn across the table for a moment, and then she looked at her plate, and then she reached across and added a second biscuit to Eli's plate because his bowl was empty, and she had seen him looking at the bread basket and not taking anything. Eli looked at the biscuit, then at his aunt. "Thank you," he said. "Eat it," Mara said. He ate it. The supper continued. The lamp burned. The stove ticked with the even warmth of a fire properly banked. Outside, the January cold was doing exactly what it had been doing. Enormous and indifferent, And inside the Rourke ranch house, the kitchen held its heat and its light against it, with the steady, unspectacular persistence of a thing that had been built to last. Evelyn cleared the plates. Caleb brought the coffee cups to the table. Mara wiped down Sadie's hands, which had accumulated something that required investigation. Eli moved to the far end of the table and opened his schoolbook. The evening did what evenings did. It was ordinary. It was entirely, specifically ordinary. And Evelyn stood at the sink with her hands in the wash water and looked at the window and the dark outside it and thought that ordinary was the thing she had been crossing 1,000 miles toward without knowing that was what she was looking for. The tin box sat on the shelf above the stove, where she had put it on the first morning, where it had been ever since. It was not packed. It had not been packed since the first week. She had not been planning to leave for a long time. She just hadn't said it out loud until now. February came in hard and stayed hard, the way February in Montana always did, as if the month had something to prove after January had already made its point. Cold settled into the bones of the ranch house and required constant management, and Evelyn managed it the way she managed everything, systematically, without drama, by staying one step ahead of what the cold was planning to do next. The wedding was set for March. Not because March was a romantic month in Blackwater Ridge, it was not. March being the territory's most ambivalent season, capable of snow and mud and premature warmth within the same week, but because March was when the worst of the winter work eased, and Caleb could spare 2 days from the ranch without the operational consequence that January or February would have demanded. She had not been the one to suggest March. He had, with the practical directness that she had come to understand, was his version of consideration. He had thought about what the ranch needed and what the timing allowed, and he had named the month that balanced both. She had agreed immediately. She was not a woman who required a proposal of spring flowers. What she had required, and what she was still working through in the quiet hours of early morning, when the house was dark and the stove was the only thing awake, was the question of what she was actually building here. Not the wedding was a legal and social fact, straightforward in its components. What she was building was something less nameable, a life that belonged to her in a way that no household she'd managed in 15 years had belonged to her. A table she sat at as a member of the family rather than its architect. A set of relationships with Caleb, with the children, with Mara, with Mrs. Pruitt, with Dewey, with the Brennan family 7 miles east, that were hers to tend and be tended by in return. She had not had that before. She had been useful, consistently and genuinely useful, in every house she'd worked. But useful and belonging were not the same thing, and she had spent enough years confusing them that she was still learning to tell them apart. The letter from Helena arrived the second week of February, addressed to Tom Brennan, forwarded through Caleb's lawyer. Caleb brought it out to the Brennan place himself on a Tuesday morning, and Evelyn went with him because she had written the initial inquiry, and she wanted to hear the answer in the same room as the Brennans, not secondhand across a supper table. The lawyer's assessment was careful and specific in the way that good lawyers are careful, and specific. He outlined what he believed could be argued, what would be difficult to argue, and what he could not predict. The material misrepresentation claim was viable, he wrote, but not certain. Key factor was the testimony of witnesses to what Whitmore's representative had said at the signing specifically, whether the description given had been materially different from the documented reality of the water rights function. Haggerty's son, it turned out, was willing to talk. This became known through a chain that Evelyn had not anticipated and had not engineered, which was perhaps why it worked. Margaret Brennan had run into young Haggerty at the general store in late January, and they had spoken briefly, and Margaret had said something she described afterward as just the truth of what was happening to them. And young Haggerty had gone home and apparently not slept well for 3 nights, and had then come to the Brennan place on a Sunday morning and told Tom Brennan what he remembered hearing Whitmore's man say at the signing. It was not a confession. It was not dramatic. It was a 22-year-old man telling the truth because he had been raised to tell it, and had been not telling it for long enough that it had become uncomfortable to carry. What he described was specific and clear. Whitmore's representative had described the tributary as insignificant seasonal overflow. No operational value to your primary water supply. Those words, in that order. Haggerty remembered them because they had seemed, even at the time, like words chosen carefully to mean less than they sounded. Tom Brennan's jaw, when Haggerty finished, had a quality that Evelyn recognized from the day she'd laid the survey map in front of him, the quality of a man absorbing a thing he'd already half known and was now required to fully know. The lawyer filed a formal misrepresentation claim against Whitmore's investment group in late February. It would take months, possibly longer. Montana territorial courts moved at their own pace, and the investment group had lawyers of their own who would make it slower. But it was filed. It was in the record. And the record was the thing that mattered, because it was the thing that persisted after the moment passed. Whitmore left the territory in early March. Evelyn heard this from Mrs. Pruitt, who had heard it from someone at the boarding house. He had not withdrawn the purchase agreements he'd already completed, but he had stopped pursuing new ones, and the particular predatory patients he'd been applying to the valley's ranchers had apparently relocated to somewhere more convenient. She did not celebrate this. She was not a woman who celebrated the absence of a problem as though it were the same as the resolution of one. The Brennan claim was still open. The water rights were still sold. What had been preserved was the possibility of remedy, and possibility was not the same as outcome, and she knew better than to confuse them. But she also knew this. The valley looked different in March than it had in October, not because Whitmore was gone, though that mattered, because the ranchers in it had started talking to each other in ways they hadn't before, comparing documents, sharing information, showing up at each other's places for reasons that weren't always strictly practical. The isolation that made people like Whitmore possible, the isolation of people who believed that their problems were uniquely their own, and that asking for help was an admission of failure, had cracked a little, not broken. These were proud, practical people in a hard place, and they would go back to their own business as soon as the immediate pressure eased, because that was human nature, and she understood human nature. But the crack was there, and cracks let things in. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-March, when the snow was melting unevenly and the mud was making its annual argument with everyone's boots, and the light had that particular thin, earnest quality of early spring in the territory, not quite warm, not quite convincing, but trying. Evelyn had not wanted a large occasion. She had seen large occasions, had cooked for them, managed the logistics of them, cleaned up after them, and she understood their purpose without feeling any particular need to be the center of one. What she wanted, and what she got, was the people who mattered in the same room at the same time, which turned out to be more people than she'd expected, because the definition of people who mattered had expanded considerably since October. The ceremony was held in the Rourke ranch house front room, which Mara had cleaned with a thoroughness that Evelyn chose not to comment on, because Mara would not have wanted it commented on. There were no flowers. Nothing was blooming yet, but there were branches of early budding willow from the creek that Sadie had brought in, and arranged with the serious, focused effort of a child who has been assigned a task she considers important. They were not elegantly arranged. They were arranged with intensity, which was better. The justice of the peace from Blackwater Ridge performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had performed many ceremonies and understood that the legal portion was not the important portion was. Whatever the people involved made of it before and after. Eli carried the ring. He had asked to, which had surprised Evelyn and had not surprised Caleb, who understood his nephew in ways that Evelyn was still learning. Eli carried it in his right hand, in a small wooden box he'd made himself in Dewey's workshop over 3 evenings, which was not a perfectly made box. The lid didn't quite lie flat, and one of the corners was slightly off, but was made with the same focused attention he brought to things he considered worth making properly. Sadie cried from approximately the 3rd sentence of the ceremony until well after it ended, with the wholehearted, unself-conscious commitment of a child who has been told that crying at weddings is acceptable and has taken this information seriously. She was not crying from sadness, her face, between the tears, was entirely composed of satisfaction. The expression of someone watching something they had decided should happen finally happening. Margaret and Tom Brennan were there, with their 3 children. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front chair and wore the expression of someone who had watched over this ranch for a long time and was cautiously, specifically glad about this particular development. Dewey stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and his sun-damaged face in the arrangement that Evelyn had learned meant he was moved by something and was managing it with his characteristic economy. The Mara, who had stood on the porch in October and announced Evelyn's inadequacy to anyone within hearing, was not exactly the same. Mara, who stood in the front room in March and watched her brother put a ring on this woman's finger. She was the same person, stubborn, direct, not easy. Not soft, but something in her had shifted and settled the way ground settles after frost leaves it. Not dramatically transformed, but reorganized around a new truth. When the ceremony ended, Mara looked at Evelyn for a moment. Just a moment. She would have argued with you at the wedding too, Mara said. Clara. She would have had opinions about the willow branches. I would have listened to them, Evelyn said. That's probably why she would have liked you. Mara straightened her own sleeve. A small, habitual gesture. She liked people who listened. She had to fight too hard her whole life for people to do it. It was, Evelyn understood, the most generous thing Mara Rourke was going to say about her, possibly ever. She received it the way it was given directly, without embellishment. Thank you, she said. Mara nodded once and went to help Margaret Brennan with the children, who had reached the point in any ceremony where staying still was no longer a reasonable expectation. The afternoon after the wedding, when the guests had gone and the children were somewhere in the house, doing things that were audible but not alarming, Caleb came into the kitchen. Evelyn was at the stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his coat still on, his hat in his hand, occupying the doorframe the way he always did, the particular solidity of a very large man in a domestic space, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since November, with that inside face fully out, not managed, just present. You don't have to cook tonight, he said. I know, she was making the broth. Not because she had to, because she wanted to, because this was where she started when she needed to begin something, and today felt like a beginning in a way that warranted the ritual of it. The charred onion, the bone, the herbs from the pantry, the slow patient heat. Down. He sat at the table. He set his hat on the chair beside him. Eli's box was crooked, Caleb said it was. He knew it was. He almost didn't bring it. What changed his mind? Caleb turned his coffee cup. Told him that the most important things I own have something wrong with them. The barn door's been slightly off plumb since 1874. My father's brand iron has a crack in the handle. The ring I put on your finger has a chip in the stone that my mother never got repaired. He paused. I told him that the things people actually use and care about are never perfect. Only the things in boxes stay perfect. Evelyn kept her hands on the pot. He brought the box, she said. He brought the box. Stirred the broth. The kitchen was warm and specific around them, the smell of the charred onion developing into something deeper, the particular sound of a pot beginning to work, the thin winter light still coming through the east window at a low angle. I have something I want to say, she said, and I want to say it right. He waited. She turned from the stove and looked at him. I have spent 15 years making other people's houses work, she said. I was good at it. I'm still good at it. But I did it in the way you do a thing when you've decided that the work is the closest thing to belonging that you're going to get. She looked at him steadily. I had stopped expecting more than that. Not because I was without hope, I'm not a person without hope, but because I had gotten practical about it. The way you got practical about the agency. He nodded. Listening. This is not that, she said. What's here? This is not me making this house work, because the work is a substitute for something else. It's I'm here because this is where I am. The work and the being here are not separate things. She paused. I don't know if I'm saying this clearly. You're saying it clearly, he said. I just need you to know the difference. Between someone who makes a house work and someone who is home in it, she looked at him. I am home in it, for whatever that's worth. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was already lit, even in the afternoon, because the light in March was still uncertain, and the kitchen was better with the lamp. It's worth everything, he said. He said it simply, without decoration, which was the only way he said the things that were true. Turned back to the stove. The broth was developing. She added the herbs the thyme crushed between her fingers, the marjoram, the bay leaf, and the kitchen filled with the particular smell that had started everything. That first morning in October when she'd burned an onion and nearly given Caleb Rourke a heart attack before 6 in the morning. She almost smiled thinking about it. What? He said. Nothing. She stirred the pot. I'm thinking about the first morning. The smoke. You came downstairs ready to carry someone out of the building. There was a great deal of smoke, he said, with dignity. There was an appropriate amount of smoke for what I was doing. She turned and looked at him, and this time she did smile, fully, which was something she didn't do carelessly, and he had learned to watch for. You stood in that doorway, looking like you were personally offended by the onion. I was concerned, he said, about a fire. You were concerned about a stranger in your kitchen at 6 in the morning doing something you didn't understand. Pause. That too, he said. She turned back to the pot. He stayed at the table. The broth worked. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the March wind was doing something unpredictable with the temperature, the way March always did, as if the season hadn't quite decided yet which direction it was going. That was all right. She had learned to work with what was available and adjust as it changed. It was the same skill whether you were managing a kitchen or a life, and she had been doing one long enough that the other did not frighten her. In the weeks that followed the wedding, the ranch moved into the particular rhythm of early spring, the mud season that preceded the possibility of real work, the slow reappearance of the ground from under the snow, the first tentative days when the light lasted long enough to feel like a reprieve. Cattle that had been in the winter pasture were moved. The garden frames were uncovered. Dewey began the annual argument with the north fence that he had every spring, and every spring resolved in the fence's favor eventually, and this year was no different. Eli turned 10 in April. He told Evelyn 2 weeks before his birthday that he did not want a large occasion, which she understood to mean he wanted something specific rather than something generic, and she asked him what specific looked like to him. He thought about it for a day. She had noticed that he always needed a day to consider things he was asked directly, as though the asking required time to settle before the answer could surface, and then he came to the kitchen and said, "The broth, and the bread," and Dewey could come. So that was what they had. The broth and the bread and Dewey, and Mara and Sadie and Caleb, and it was not large and it was not impressive, and Eli sat at the table with the specific, contained happiness of a child who has gotten exactly what he actually wanted, which is rarer than it sounds. Sadie presented him with a drawing she had made of the ranch that had been worked on for what appeared to be several days, based on the number of layers of detail and the places where she'd started over. The barn was slightly taller than the house. The garden was in full summer bloom, despite it being April. Evelyn appeared in the drawing as a figure slightly wider than the others, with dark hair and an apron and a spoon in one hand, standing in front of the kitchen window. Eli looked at the drawing for a long time. "You drew Evelyn bigger than Uncle Caleb," he said. Sadie examined her drawing with the critical eye of the artist. "She takes up more space," she said, in the good way. Nobody corrected this. The Brennan claim settled in June. In the manner of things that are not fully won and not fully lost, Whitmore's investment group, faced with the cost and complication of a contested legal proceeding in a territorial court, offered a partial restoration of the water rights and a financial settlement. It was not everything Tom Brennan had sold. It was more than nothing, which was what he'd had in February. He accepted it on a Tuesday, came over to the Rourke Ranch on Wednesday, sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee with Caleb and Evelyn, and said very little for a long time. Then he said, "Margaret wants to know if you'll teach her to make that broth." "Yes," Evelyn said. "She said to tell you she's a slow learner." "Everyone is the first few times," Evelyn said. "That's not the same as not learning." He nodded, finished his coffee. He was not a man of many words, which was something he and Caleb had in common, and the two of them sitting at that table with their cups said more in their silence than most men said in an hour. What they said was something about endurance, and about the particular kind of trust that develops between people who have faced the wind from the same direction and are still standing. Evelyn refilled their cups and went back to what she was doing. This was what she had found. In the end, not what she'd been looking for when she'd answered a newspaper advertisement in Cincinnati on a November morning 14 months ago, not what Hartwell's Western Placement Service had described in its careful, optimistic language, not what the photograph of a younger woman in a borrowed dress had promised anyone. She had found that belonging was not a place you arrived at. It was a thing you built slowly from the available materials, which were never quite the right materials and were always enough if you were patient and honest and willing to adjust. She had built it in a kitchen that wasn't hers and then became hers. In a garden she planted in someone else's fallow ground. In an account ledger she'd corrected line by line, in documents she'd read in lamplight, in a cup of broth given to a child who had forgotten that wanting something was allowed. She had built it by showing up every morning and doing the work in front of her, which was neither heroic nor uncomplicated. Some mornings she had been uncertain. Some mornings she had been tired in a way that went below the physical. Some mornings she had stood at the stove and thought about the 1,000 miles and the photograph and Mara's voice on the platform, and had felt briefly the familiar pull of the question she'd been asking herself her whole adult life, whether she was enough for the space she was trying to occupy. The answer she had arrived at over these months was not a confident yes. It was something less simple and more durable than that. The answer was, she was what she was. And what she was had turned out to be sufficient, and sufficiency honestly held was better than perfection performed. She had learned this not from any single moment, but from the accumulation of small ones, Eli's first-second bowl, Sadie's grip on her brother's shirt loosening, Mara sitting down at a table and picking up dough and saying, "Show me too," Caleb's voice in the cold saying, "You belong here," before he was ready to say anything larger. She had learned it from a tin box on a shelf that she no longer carried like something about to be taken. By summer, the garden was producing, in the earnest, chaotic way of a garden that had been properly set up, and then left to its own decisions. The tomatoes against the south wall were doing exactly what Dewey had predicted. The corn was taller than Eli. The beets were coming in so abundantly that Evelyn had to work out a system for dealing with them that satisfied Sesam's requirement that they be cooked right, and Mara's newly discovered opinion that beets were acceptable if roasted long enough, and Caleb's characteristic position that he would eat whatever was on the table without comment. She roasted them with salt and a little of the rendered fat, and the result was, according to Sadie, right? Evelyn accepted this verdict with the same seriousness with which it was delivered. Some things in life could not be fully explained. Why this particular combination of temperature and fat and time produced a beet that a 6-year-old classified as right, while other combinations did not, she could not explain it. She had the knowledge of it, accumulated through iteration and failure and adjustment, and she could produce it reliably. That was all knowledge ever was in the end. Not certainty, just enough accumulated experience to be reliable. One evening in July, she stood at the kitchen window after supper and looked at the garden in the long's summer light and thought about something she'd been thinking about intermittently for months, the way you think about a thing you haven't found the right words for yet. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with a worn satchel and a tin box and 1,000 miles of exhaustion, and the particular courage of someone who has run out of alternatives and decided to treat that as a beginning rather than an ending. She did not think of that woman as someone she had been. She thought of her as someone she still was, the same woman, just in possession of more information about what she was capable of, which was not a transformation, but an accumulation. You did not become someone different when things got better. You became more completely yourself, which was harder to achieve and worth considerably more. She heard Caleb's boots on the porch, and then the door, and then the particular sound of a large man trying to come in quietly because he'd seen the light in the kitchen and didn't know if she was in the middle of something. "I'm done," she said without turning around. "You don't have to be careful." He came into the kitchen. She turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had that first full morning, when she'd stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled up, and her hair half down, and the smoke from the charred onion doing what it was doing, and he hadn't known what to do with a woman who refused to be ashamed of the space she occupied. He still sometimes looked at her with that same quality of careful, revised understanding, as if he was still slowly revising. She did not mind being revised toward. She had done enough revising herself to know that it was not an insult. It was the thing that happened when someone looked at you honestly and kept looking until they saw what was actually there. "Come eat something," she said. "You didn't finish supper." "I finished supper." "You moved it around the plate and ate half." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down." He sat. She made him something simple, the broth, because the broth was always right, with bread from the morning and butter, and a bowl of the garden's abundance on the side. She set it in front of him and sat across from him with her own cup of something, and they were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not the absence of communication, but a form of it, the particular ease of two people who have said the hard things, and found that saying them did not break anything. Outside, the summer dark was coming in soft and specific, the ridge visible against the last of the light, the garden done for the day, the barn quiet. The tin box sat on its shelf where it had been since October, painted lid rust-edged and worn, full of recipes that were not really about food, they were about paying attention, about knowing what a thing needed and providing it, about the patience of returning to something every day until it became what it was supposed to be. She had not crossed 1,000 miles to be diminished. She had crossed them because diminishment had followed her everywhere she'd been, and she had decided, finally, that the answer was not to find a place where people would think better of her. The answer was to go somewhere and become, through the daily, unspectacular practice of her own competence and care, someone that even she could not overlook. That was the thing nobody had told her, and she'd had to find herself. Not that she deserved love because she was useful, or because she was strong, or because she had proven herself adequate to a hard place. That she deserved it the same way everyone did, not because of what she could do, but because of what she was, which was specific and flawed and honest and present, and which had turned out, in the particular calculus of this particular life, to be exactly enough. She did not have to be smaller to be seen. She had only ever needed to stand still long enough for the world to finish catching up with her. Caleb ate. The kitchen held its warmth. The tin box sat on the shelf, unpacked, permanent, the lid slightly ajar the way she kept it now, not because she'd forgotten to close it, but because she'd stopped needing it closed. Stopped treating its contents as something to be protected from a life that might take it, and started treating them as something available, ready, belonging to a kitchen that was hers. Outside, the Montana summer went on doing what it did. Inside, the broth was good. That was enough. It had always been enough. She was just finally in a place where she could say so.